The email arrived at 3 a.m., and Daniel Cross knew his life was about to shatter. 5 years of dedication, countless lives saved, a spotless record, until now. One supervisor, 17 accusations, and tomorrow morning a meeting that could destroy everything he'd built since his wife's death. For Daniel, this wasn't just about keeping a job. It was about keeping his daughter fed, housed, and safe. But Eleanor Graves had made her position brutally clear. One more phone check, and he's done. What she didn't know? Every single one of those checks was a lifeline. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The phone screen's blue glow cut through the darkness like a knife through fabric. Daniel Cross sat motionless on the edge of his bed, his weathered hands trembling as they gripped the device. The email subject line burned itself into his retinas. Mandatory HR meeting, Daniel Cross, 9 a.m. sharp. He'd been awake anyway. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Not since Jessica died, not since the world became his responsibility alone. 3 in the morning was when the quiet felt loudest, when the weight of single fatherhood pressed down on his chest like a physical thing. Usually, he'd use these hours to prep Mila's lunch, review her homework, or simply sit in her doorway and watch her sleep, reassuring himself that she was still breathing, still safe, still his. But tonight, this morning, the silence screamed. Daniel's thumb scrolled through the email again, searching for details that weren't there. No explanation, no context, just the sterile, bureaucratic command to appear. But he knew. God help him, he knew exactly what this was about. Eleanor Graves. His new supervisor had arrived at St. Catherine's Pediatric ICU 6 months ago with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Where the previous unit manager, gentle Margaret Chen, had led with compassion and understanding, Eleanor ruled with spreadsheets and surveillance. She'd made her priorities clear from day one: efficiency metrics, reduced liability, and absolute adherence to hospital policy, particularly the newly enforced personal device usage protocol. Daniel had already received 2 written warnings, 2 pieces of paper that now sat in his personnel file like landmines, waiting for the third strike that would obliterate his career. And he knew, with the sickening certainty that comes from watching someone build a case against you, that Eleanor had been documenting every moment, every glance at his phone, every second he dared to be both a nurse and a father. 17 times. That's what the second warning had said. 17 observed instances of unauthorized personal device usage during working hours. 17 times he'd checked whether his daughter was safe. The irony wasn't lost on him. He worked in a pediatric intensive care unit where parents camped in waiting rooms with phones clutched like rosaries, desperately waiting for updates about their children. He held those parents when they collapsed under the weight of bad news. He'd learned to recognize the exact timbre of a mother's voice when hope began to crack. He understood, bone deep, the primal terror of not knowing if your child was okay. And yet, somehow, checking on his own daughter made him a liability. Daniel set the phone on his nightstand and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The gesture did nothing to stop the images flooding his mind. Mila's face when he'd have to tell her they were moving again. The confusion in her 7-year-old eyes when she'd ask why Daddy couldn't keep a job. The way her small voice would shake when she'd inevitably ask if it was her fault. Because she'd asked that before, after Jessica died. Is it my fault Mommy's gone? The memory hit him like a physical blow. He could still see her standing in the hospital corridor, still wearing the purple dress Jessica had picked out for her 6th birthday party, a party that had been canceled when the headache Jessica had been ignoring for weeks suddenly became a seizure. Then a CT scan, then a diagnosis that came with a timeline measured in days, not years. Glioblastoma. Stage 4. Inoperable. Jessica had lasted 3 weeks. Mila had asked her question on the last day, when the machines were finally turned off and the terrible, irregular breathing had stopped. Daniel had pulled his daughter close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, and told her with every ounce of conviction he possessed that none of this, none of it, was her fault. But how could he make that same promise now? How could he tell her that losing their home, their stability, their future wasn't somehow connected to her existence, to her needs? to the fact that she required a parent who gave a damn whether she made it safely to school. The digital clock on his nightstand flipped to 3:17 a.m. In less than 6 hours, he'd walk into that HR office and face whatever Eleanor had compiled against him. The thought made his stomach churn. Daniel stood and moved quietly through the small apartment, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet. They lived in a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better decades. Peeling paint, thin walls, a chronic leak in the bathroom that the landlord kept promising to fix. But it was clean, it was safe, and most importantly, it was theirs. The rent was $1,450 a month, which was laughably cheap for the area, but still consumed most of his paycheck after utilities, groceries, and Mila's after-school program. There was no margin for error, no safety net, no wealthy relatives or inheritance waiting in the wings. When Jessica died, she'd left behind love, memories, and approximately $47,000 in medical debt that insurance had gleefully declined to cover. Daniel had been paying it down for 5 years, $500 a month like clockwork, watching the balance decrease with the same glacial pace as his hope for financial stability. His nursing salary was decent, $68,000 a year, which was above average for pediatric ICU nurses in their city. But after taxes, after rent, after the medical debt payments, after childcare and food, and the million other costs that came with raising a child alone, he was left with roughly $200 a month for emergencies, repairs, and the luxury items that normal families took for granted, like new shoes when Mila outgrew her current pair, or a winter coat that actually fit. Losing this job would be catastrophic. Daniel paused outside Mila's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, the way she insisted it be kept since Jessica's death. She needed to know she could call out and he'd hear her, that she wasn't alone in the darkness. He pushed the door open slowly, careful not to let the hinges creak. His daughter was sprawled across her twin bed in that boneless way children sleep, one arm flung over her head, her favorite stuffed elephant, a gift from Jessica on her 4th birthday, tucked under her chin. Her dark hair spread across the pillow like silk, and her face held that perfect peace that only comes to those who still believe the world is fundamentally safe. Daniel felt something crack in his chest. He'd promised Jessica, in those final hours when she could barely speak, that he'd take care of their daughter, that Mila would never doubt she was loved, wanted, cherished, that he'd be both mother and father, whatever it took. And he'd kept that promise. For 5 years, through grief and exhaustion and moments when he wasn't sure he could take another breath, he'd kept it. He'd learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos at midnight. He'd become fluent in the politics of 7-year-old friendships, knowing which girls were kind and which were already learning cruelty. He'd mastered the art of making vegetables appealing and negotiating bedtime with the skill of a hostage negotiator. He'd also become an exceptional nurse, maybe because fatherhood had taught him something about desperate love, about the fierce protectiveness that transforms ordinary people into warriors. His patients' parents recognized it in him immediately. This man understood. When he said he'd take care of their child, they believed him because they could see he knew what they were feeling. But to Eleanor Graves, all of that was just personal interference. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, not the work phone, but his personal one. He pulled it out and saw a notification from Mila's school app. Reminder, Spirit Week begins Monday. Crazy Hair Day is Tuesday. Such a small thing. A reminder about a school event that would require him to help his daughter tease her hair into something ridiculous before 7:30 a.m. In the grand scope of life, it was nothing. But it was also everything. It was the normal, beautiful minutiae of childhood that Jessica would have loved. It was proof that despite tragedy, despite loss, despite everything, Mila was still getting to be a kid, and he'd be damned if Eleanor Graves took that away. Daniel returned to his bedroom and opened his laptop. If he was going into that meeting, he wouldn't go unprepared. He pulled up his work records from the hospital's employee portal, every shift he'd worked in the past 6 months, every patient outcome, every peer review, and parent satisfaction survey. The numbers told a story Eleanor couldn't spin. Daniel Cross was good at his job. Exceptional, even. In the past year, he'd received 15 written commendations from grateful families. His patient outcomes exceeded unit averages in every metric. He'd successfully de-escalated 3 violent situations in the ICU waiting room, including one where a father high on methamphetamine had tried to assault a doctor. He'd trained 4 new nurses, all of whom specifically requested to work his shifts. He'd volunteered for every holiday, every overnight, every shift that others avoided, because he needed the money, yes, but also because he knew what it meant to those families to have someone competent caring for their children on Christmas Eve. But he'd also checked his phone 17 times. 17 times in 6 months, less than once a week, always between patient rounds, always in moments when he had explicitly cleared his schedule. Never, not once, during active patient care. Daniel began documenting each instance he could remember, matching them to his shift logs. There was the time Mila had texted that she felt sick during after-school care, and he'd needed to determine if it was serious or just her wanting attention. The day her school had a lockdown drill and she'd panicked, remembering the active shooter drills that now terrified children across America. The afternoon when Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who sometimes watched Mila when the regular sitter fell through, had texted that she'd fallen and needed to go to the hospital, and Daniel had needed to arrange emergency backup care while working a critical shift. Every single phone check had been necessary. Every single one had been about keeping his daughter safe, healthy, cared for. But Eleanor Graves saw only policy violations, infractions, evidence of a distracted employee who prioritized personal matters over professional obligations. The first warning had been delivered in person, in Eleanor's office, with an HR representative present. Daniel had tried to explain, had offered to show the text messages proving they were all child-related emergencies. Eleanor had cut him off with a raised hand and a voice like ice. "Mr. Cross, I understand you're a single parent. That must be very difficult." Her tone suggested she understood nothing of the sort. "But every employee here has personal obligations. We all have lives outside these walls. The policy exists for a reason. Patient safety requires our undivided attention." "My attention has never been divided," Daniel had said, keeping his voice steady with effort. "You can check my records. My patient outcomes are not the issue here. The issue is setting a precedent. If I allow you to use your phone during work hours, I must allow everyone the same privilege." "Where does it end?" "It ends with common sense," Daniel had replied, immediately regretting the edge in his voice. "With understanding that emergencies exist and that parents need to be able to—" "You're dismissed, Mr. Cross. This is a formal warning. I suggest you arrange more reliable childcare that doesn't require your constant supervision. You're not the only single parent in this hospital. Others manage without bringing their personal lives to work." The meeting had lasted 4 minutes. The second warning had come via email, formal and cold. "This serves as your second written warning regarding personal device usage policy violations. Further infractions will result in immediate termination. Please acknowledge receipt of this message and confirm your understanding of hospital policy." Daniel had acknowledged. He had confirmed. He had also spent the next week in a state of controlled panic, knowing that Eleanor was watching, documenting, building her case, and apparently she'd found her 17 pieces of evidence. As dawn began to paint the sky outside his window in shades of gray and pink, Daniel made a decision. He wouldn't go into that meeting apologetic. He wouldn't grovel or beg for his job. He'd done nothing wrong, nothing that any reasonable person would consider a fireable offense, and he wouldn't pretend otherwise. But he would go in prepared. He would be calm. He would present facts. And if they still decided to terminate him, well, at least he'd know he'd stood up for what was right. The alarm on his phone went off at 5:30 a.m., its cheerful melody obscene given the circumstances. Daniel silenced it and moved through his morning routine on autopilot. Shower, shave, dress in the same navy blue scrubs he'd worn 1,000 times before. In the mirror, he looked tired, the kind of tired that lived in the bones, that no amount of sleep could fix. At 34, he had gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when Jessica was alive. He looked like what he was, a man carrying too much for too long, with too little help. By 6:15, he was in the kitchen, moving through the familiar choreography of breakfast prep. Mila appeared in the doorway at 6:30, right on schedule, her hair a wild tangle and sleep still clouding her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," Daniel said, infusing false cheer into his voice. "Chocolate chip pancakes or boring old cereal?" Mila climbed onto her chair and fixed him with a look that was pure Jessica, one eyebrow raised, knowing and skeptical. You only make pancakes when something's wrong. 7 years old, and already too perceptive. Daniel felt his careful composure wobble. Can't a dad just want to make pancakes for his favorite person? He deflected, pouring batter onto the heated griddle. Your hands are shaking, Mila observed, and you forgot to put on your watch. You never forget your watch. Daniel glanced down at his bare wrist and cursed internally. She was right. The watch, a modest Timex that Jessica had given him when he graduated nursing school, was sitting on his nightstand, forgotten in his distracted morning routine. He returned to the bedroom to retrieve it, and when he came back, Mila was standing by the griddle, carefully flipping the pancakes with the oversized spatula. She looked so small, so serious, concentrating with the intensity she brought to everything important. Mila, sweetheart, you don't have to. I know, she said simply. But you look sad. When Daddy's sad, I help. And there it was, the terrible, beautiful reality of their life. This child, who should be worried about nothing more serious than her spelling test or whether Emma would share the swings at recess, had instead learned to read her father's moods, to offer comfort, to shoulder responsibilities no 7-year-old should carry. Daniel crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind, careful not to disturb her pancake flipping. She leaned back against him, and for a moment the world narrowed to just this, his daughter in his arms, safe and whole and his. I love you, he whispered into her hair, more than anything in the entire universe. Even more than pizza? Mila asked, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Even more than pizza, he confirmed. Although it's close, she giggled, that pure bubbling sound that could heal wounds he didn't know he had, and slid the pancakes onto a plate. They ate breakfast together at their small table, Mila chattering about the upcoming Spirit Week and how she wanted to dress up like a superhero for Character Day. Daniel listened, contributed where appropriate, and tried not to think about how many more mornings like this they might have in this apartment, in this routine, in this life they'd built together. At 7:15, they began the carefully choreographed dance of getting out the door. Mila brushed her teeth while Daniel packed her lunch. He brushed his teeth while she gathered her homework. He grabbed her backpack while she put on her shoes. They moved around each other like partners in a long-practiced routine, each knowing their role perfectly. Then, chaos. Mila reached for her juice box at the same moment Daniel was transferring it to her lunch bag. The box slipped, fell, and exploded across the kitchen floor, a tsunami of orange liquid spreading across the worn linoleum, seeping under the refrigerator, dripping from the edge of the counter. I'm sorry! Mila's voice immediately pitched into panic. I'm sorry, Daddy, I didn't mean… Hey, it's okay, Daniel said, grabbing paper towels. Accidents happen. Just step around it, okay? Let's get you to school first, then I'll clean this up. But Mila was frozen, staring at the orange puddle with eyes that were too wet, too frightened. You're going to be late. You're going to get in trouble because of me. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She knew. Somehow, despite all his efforts to shield her, she knew that his job was in jeopardy, that trouble was coming, that her needs were somehow the problem. Daniel dropped the paper towels and knelt in front of her, putting his hands on her small shoulders. Mila, look at me, sweetheart. She raised her eyes, Jessica's eyes, that same mix of brown and gold that changed in different light. You are not the reason for anything bad in my life. You hear me? You are the reason for every good thing. Spilled juice is just spilled juice. It's nothing. It matters 0%. What matters is you getting to school safely and me getting to work to help sick kids, and us coming home tonight and having dinner together. That's what matters, okay? She nodded, but her lip was trembling. Say it back to me, Daniel pressed gently. Say, I'm not the problem. I'm not the problem, Mila whispered. Louder. I'm not the problem, she repeated, stronger this time. That's my girl. Daniel kissed her forehead and stood. Now, let's get moving before Mrs. Patterson marks you tardy and sends me one of her legendary disappointed looks. He mopped up what he could in 30 seconds, then grabbed both their bags and ushered Mila out the door. They were running 7 minutes behind schedule. Not catastrophic, but enough to make his already tight morning even tighter. The drive to Oakwood Elementary took 12 minutes in light traffic. Daniel used the time to quiz Mila on her multiplication tables, a routine they'd established after her teacher had noted she was struggling with math. She got most of them right, stumbled on 7 times 8, and recovered. 56, she announced triumphantly. Excellent. What's 9 times 6? Silence. Then, 54? Close. 54. Think about it. 6 nines. 9, 18, 27. They counted up together, arriving at 54 just as Daniel pulled into the school's drop-off lane. The line of cars stretched around the block, parents and nannies and carpools all converging in the chaotic ballet of morning arrival. 8:03 a.m. They'd made it. Mila unbuckled her seatbelt and grabbed her backpack. Then she surprised him by leaning across the console and hugging him tight, her skinny arms surprisingly strong. Love you, Daddy? Good luck at work? The lump in Daniel's throat made it hard to speak. Love you too, sweetheart. Have a great day. I'll be here at 3:15. Promise? The question gutted him. Promise? She slipped out of the car and joined the stream of children flowing toward the school's entrance. Daniel watched until she disappeared inside, then checked his phone. 8:05 a.m. He had 55 minutes to get across town to St. Catherine's, change into fresh scrubs, the ones he was wearing had orange juice splattered on the hem, discovered too late, and present himself at HR by 9 o'clock. He could make it. Barely. The drive to the hospital took 18 minutes, his foot hovering at the speed limit's edge, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Best case, this was a misunderstanding, a chance for him to explain the context behind those phone checks, and Eleanor would see reason. Worst case, he'd be escorted from the building by security, his access badge deactivated, his career in pediatric nursing effectively ended. The middle ground, some kind of final warning, a probationary period, additional scrutiny, seemed most likely. He could live with that. He could adapt, find workarounds, arrange his life to be even more airtight than it already was. St. Catherine's Medical Center rose before him, a sprawling complex of buildings that had been expanded and renovated so many times it resembled an architectural Frankenstein. Daniel parked in the employee lot, grabbed his work bag, and jogged toward the staff entrance. 8:31 a.m. He swiped his badge, the familiar beep of approval, the green light that meant he still belonged here, and headed straight for the locker rooms. The pediatric ICU was on the 4th floor, but HR was in the administrative wing on the 2nd floor, accessible via a different elevator bank. In the locker room, Daniel stripped off his juice-stained scrubs and pulled on fresh ones. He checked his appearance in the mirror, presentable, professional, tired, but not disheveled. He looked like a man who could be trusted with the lives of critically ill children. Because he was that man. Whatever else was true, whatever Eleanor Graves thought about his phone usage, that fundamental truth remained. Daniel Cross was a damn good nurse. 8:44 a.m. He locked his personal belongings in his locker and headed for HR. The walk through the hospital's corridors felt surreal. He passed colleagues he'd worked with for years, doctors and nurses and technicians who nodded greeting or called out, "Hey, Dan," as if this were a normal day. As if his entire life weren't about to be judged and potentially dismantled in Conference Room B. The HR wing was quieter, carpeted where the rest of the hospital had linoleum, painted in soothing neutrals instead of clinical white. Motivational posters lined the walls. Teamwork makes the dream work, and excellence in patient care, their cheerful messages feeling especially hollow given the circumstances. Daniel found Conference Room B and paused outside its closed door. Through the small window, he could see 2 figures already seated, Karen Chen from Human Resources, no relation to the former unit manager, and Eleanor Graves. Eleanor sat ramrod straight, her silver hair pulled into its customary tight bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed papers in a manila folder. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the thickness of that file, the careful organization of its contents. She'd been thorough. He'd give her that. 8:47 a.m. Daniel took a breath, steadied himself, and knocked. "Come in," Karen's voice called. He entered the conference room with his head high and his shoulders back, not defiant, but not defeated either. He was here to explain himself, to defend his choices, and to make them understand something that should have been obvious. Being a parent and being a professional weren't mutually exclusive. They were, in his case, inextricably linked. "Good morning, Mr. Cross," Karen said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "Please, have a seat." Daniel sat. He folded his hands on the table in front of him and met first Karen's eyes, then Eleanor's. Eleanor spoke first, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Mr. Cross, you're here because we've documented a pattern of behavior that violates hospital policy and raises serious concerns about your professional judgment. I understand you have concerns," Daniel replied evenly. "I'm here to address them." Eleanor opened the manila folder and began extracting papers, printed screenshots of security camera footage, time-stamped logs, written observations from supervisors. She laid them out like a prosecutor presenting evidence, creating a damning timeline of Daniel's alleged infractions. 17 documented instances, Eleanor said, tapping one manicured finger on the stack of papers. 17 times you were observed using your personal phone during work hours in direct violation of the personal device usage policy that every employee signed upon hiring. "I'm aware of the policy," Daniel said, "and I'm aware you've documented my phone usage. What those documents don't show is the context." "Context is irrelevant to policy," Eleanor interrupted. "The policy doesn't say no phone usage unless you have a good reason. It says no phone usage. Period." Daniel felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "With respect, Ms. Graves, context is always relevant. Policy exists to serve safety and professionalism, not to punish employees for being responsible parents. Being a parent is not a special exemption to workplace rules. I'm not asking for an exemption. I'm asking for understanding of the difference between checking my phone while actively caring for a patient, which I have never done, and checking it between rounds during scheduled break time to ensure my 7-year-old daughter is safe." Eleanor's expression didn't soften. "Other employees manage their parenting responsibilities without bringing them to work. Do they?" Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Or do they have partners at home? Grandparents nearby? Financial resources to hire full-time childcare? I don't have those luxuries, Ms. Graves. It's just me. It's been just me for 5 years since my wife died and I became my daughter's only parent. Every single one of those 17 phone checks was about one thing, making sure Mila was okay. That's it. That's all I was doing." Karen Chen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Cross, I think what Ms. Graves is trying to communicate is that the hospital needs to maintain consistent standards for all employees. We understand your situation is difficult." "Difficult?" Daniel couldn't quite keep the edge from his voice. "My situation isn't difficult. It's reality. It's being a single parent working a demanding job in a country that offers virtually no support system for people like me. It's living paycheck to paycheck and knowing that one mistake, one policy violation could make my daughter homeless. That's not difficult. That's terrifying." The room fell silent. Eleanor's expression remained stony, but something flickered in Karen's eyes. Maybe sympathy, maybe understanding. Daniel took a breath and continued, this time controlling his emotion, speaking with the calm precision he used when explaining complex medical situations to frightened parents. "I've worked in pediatric ICU for 8 years. 5 of those years have been here at St. Catherine's. In that time, I have never let my personal life interfere with patient care. My outcomes exceed unit averages in every metric. I have 15 commendations from grateful families. I've trained new nurses, de-escalated violent situations, volunteered for holidays and overnights that nobody else wanted. I'm good at my job precisely because I understand what these parents are going through, because I know what it feels like to love a child so much that the thought of something happening to them stops your heart." He pulled out his own folder, the one he'd prepared at 4 a.m., full of printed metrics and parent testimonials and peer reviews. "This is my record. This is what I bring to St. Catherine's every single day. And yes, sometimes, less than once a week on average, I check my phone to make sure my daughter is safe. Those checks take 30 seconds. They happen during scheduled breaks or between patients. They have never compromised my care, not once." Daniel met Eleanor's eyes directly. "So, if you're going to fire me, at least be honest about why. It's not because I'm a bad nurse. It's because you have a problem with me being a father who gives a damn about his child." The silence that followed was absolute. Karen looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Daniel and Eleanor. Eleanor's face had gone carefully blank, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her pen. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Your performance metrics are not in question here, Mr. Cross. Your adherence to policy is." "Then the policy is wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel saw Karen's eyes widen slightly. He just told his supervisor, in front of HR, that hospital policy was wrong. It was either brave or career suicide, and he suspected it was both. But he meant it. He meant every word. Because if caring whether his child was safe made him a liability in their eyes, then he was standing in the wrong place. And maybe, it was time they knew it. Eleanor closed her folder with deliberate care. "I think," she said slowly, "we need to take a brief recess. Mr. Cross, please wait outside." It wasn't a request. Daniel stood, gathered his papers, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back. "I'm not sorry," he said quietly, "for checking on my daughter, for being present in her life, for making sure she knows she's loved and safe and important. I'm not sorry for any of it. Whatever you decide in there, I'll live with. But I won't apologize for being her father." He stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. And for the first time since the 3 a.m. email, Daniel Cross felt something other than fear. He felt certain. Whatever came next, he'd told the truth. He'd stood up for what was right. And if that cost him everything, well, at least Mila would grow up knowing her father had principles worth fighting for. The hallway clock read 9:23 a.m. Through the conference room's window, he could see Eleanor and Karen in intense discussion, their faces serious. His fate was being decided in there by people who would go home tonight to lives that looked nothing like his, who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to balance survival on the edge of a knife. Daniel leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. And he waited. The minutes stretched like hours. Daniel remained in the hallway, watching hospital staff pass by, some offering curious glances, others too absorbed in their own urgencies to notice a lone nurse standing outside HR. His legs ached from standing, but sitting felt like surrender, like accepting whatever verdict was being prepared behind that closed door. At 9:47, the conference room door opened. Karen stepped out first, her expression professionally neutral in a way that revealed nothing. Eleanor followed, and Daniel couldn't help but notice the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her mouth formed a thin, disapproving line. "Mr. Cross," Karen said, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone delivering bad news regularly. "Please come back in." Daniel entered the room and sat. He noticed Eleanor had reorganized her papers, creating neat stacks that suggested conclusions had been reached, decisions made. His personnel file lay open between them, his entire professional life reduced to documents and data points. Karen spoke first, folding her hands on the table. "We've reviewed your case thoroughly, and we've also discussed the broader implications of the personal device usage policy as it applies to employees with caregiving responsibilities." Daniel waited. He'd learned in nursing that silence was often more powerful than speaking, that letting others fill the void sometimes revealed truths they hadn't intended to share. "Your record here is exemplary," Karen continued. "Your patient outcomes, your peer evaluations, the feedback from families, all of it speaks to your competence and dedication. Ms. Graves has acknowledged this." Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded. "Your clinical skills are not in question." "However," Karen said, and Daniel felt his stomach drop at that single word, "policy violations are serious matters. We can't simply ignore documented infractions, regardless of the circumstances surrounding them." "So you're firing me?" Daniel kept his voice level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. "No." Eleanor spoke the word like it tasted bitter. "We're not terminating you today, but we are placing you on a formal performance improvement plan, effective immediately. This will remain in your file for 12 months. Any additional policy violations during that period will result in immediate dismissal without further review." Relief and resentment warred in Daniel's chest. He still had his job, but it came with strings attached, with Eleanor's surveillance intensified, with the constant knowledge that one wrong move would end everything. "What exactly does this performance improvement plan entail?" he asked. Karen slid a document across the table. "You'll meet with Ms. Graves weekly to review your adherence to all hospital policies, with particular focus on device usage. You'll also be required to submit a written plan for managing your personal obligations in a way that doesn't interfere with work responsibilities." Written plan. Daniel couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. "You want me to document how I'm parenting my daughter?" "We want you to demonstrate that you can maintain professional boundaries," Eleanor corrected sharply. "Other single parents manage without constant phone checks. You need to develop similar strategies." Daniel stared at her, this woman who had no idea what his life looked like, who had never woken at 3 a.m. wondering if she could make rent, who had probably never packed a lunch with shaking hands while calculating whether there was enough money for both groceries and the electric bill. "May I ask you something, Ms. Graves?" His tone was carefully neutral. "Do you have children?" Eleanor's expression flickered just for a moment before returning to its usual stoic mask. "My personal life is not relevant to this discussion." "Isn't it? You're judging my parenting. You're telling me I need to care less about my daughter's safety. That seems pretty personal." "I'm telling you to follow policy," Eleanor snapped. And there it was, the crack in her professional veneer. "I'm telling you that being a parent doesn't entitle you to special treatment. Everyone has responsibilities outside of work. We all make sacrifices. That's what being an adult means." Sacrifices. Daniel tasted the word. "What sacrifices have you made exactly? Do you know what it's like to choose between buying your child new shoes and paying for heat? To lie awake calculating whether you can afford one more sick day? To explain to a 7-year-old why you can't afford the field trip that every other kid in her class gets to go on?" "Mr. Cross." Karen tried to interject, but Daniel wasn't finished. "Those 17 phone checks? Let me tell you what they were. One was when my daughter texted me that a man was following her and her sitter at the park. One was when she had a panic attack during a lockdown drill, and the school counselor needed my permission to help her. One was when my neighbor, the 78-year-old woman who watches Mila when I work nights, fell and broke her hip, and I needed to arrange emergency care while I was in the middle of a 12-hour shift." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages, finding the ones he'd saved as evidence. "Here. This one from October 15th. Daddy, I threw up at school. My head hurts bad. Can you come get me? She had the flu. Fever of 103, but I was here working, so I had to coordinate pickup through my backup sitter while monitoring her symptoms via text to make sure she didn't need the ER." Daniel set the phone on the table between them. Every single check was an emergency. Every single one was me being a responsible parent while also being a responsible employee. "So tell me, Ms. Graves, which of those situations should I have ignored? Which one makes me unprofessional?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor's face had gone carefully blank, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Karen looked distinctly uncomfortable, her eyes fixed on the phone as if it might bite her. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice tight. "This isn't about individual circumstances. It's about consistency. If we make exceptions for you, we must make them for everyone." "Then make them for everyone," Daniel said simply. "Create a policy that acknowledges human beings have emergencies. The parents need to be able to check on their children. The caring about your family doesn't make you a bad employee. It makes you a whole person. The policy exists for a reason." "The policy is broken." Daniel leaned forward, putting every ounce of conviction into his words. "It's broken because it treats compassion like a liability. It's broken because it punishes people for having lives outside these walls. And it's especially broken when applied by someone who's never had to make the choices I make every single day." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I've made plenty of difficult choices, Mr. Cross. Don't presume to know anything about my life." "Then help me understand," Daniel said, rising to meet her gaze. "Because right now all I see is someone who's decided that being a good parent and being a good nurse are mutually exclusive. And I'm here to tell you, as someone who is both, that you're wrong." The air between them crackled with tension. Karen cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should all take a moment." "I don't need a moment." Eleanor gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. "I need Mr. Cross to understand that his employment here is conditional upon following the rules, all of them, without exception. She turned to face him fully. Sign the performance improvement plan or don't. But if you refuse, consider this your resignation. Daniel looked down at the document Karen had slid across the table. 3 pages of requirements, restrictions, and weekly check-ins. 12 months of probation. One mistake away from losing everything. He thought of Mila asking if he'd be there at 3:15, her voice saying promise, the trust in her eyes that had never wavered, even when the world gave her every reason to doubt. He picked up the pen. I'll sign it, he said quietly. But not because you're right. I'll sign it because my daughter needs me employed more than she needs me to win this argument. He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the document, each letter feeling like a betrayal of every principle he defended minutes earlier. But principle didn't pay rent. Principle didn't keep a 7-year-old fed and clothed and safe. Good. Eleanor took the signed document and placed it in his file. Your first check-in is Friday at 7 a.m. before your shift. Don't be late. Daniel nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. He gathered his phone and stood to leave. Mr. Cross, Karen said, stopping him at the door. Her voice was gentler now, almost apologetic. For what it's worth, I think you're doing an incredible job under impossible circumstances. I hope you know that. He met her eyes and saw genuine sympathy there. It didn't change anything. She'd still sat silently while Eleanor dressed him down, still enforced a policy she probably knew was unjust, but it was something. Thank you, he said, because his mother had raised him to be polite even when he wanted to scream. Daniel left the conference room at 10:03 a.m. His shift didn't start until noon, which gave him nearly 2 hours to kill. He couldn't go home. The drive there and back would eat up too much time. He couldn't face the break room, where colleagues would ask questions he didn't want to answer. Instead, he found himself walking toward the hospital's small chapel on the first floor. It was a non-denominational space, quiet and dim, with simple wooden pews and a stained glass window that caught the morning light. Daniel hadn't prayed since Jessica's funeral, hadn't seen the point in talking to a deity that had taken his wife and left him alone. But he needed somewhere to breathe, to think, to not be watched. He sat in the back pew and let his head fall into his hands. The performance improvement plan felt like a noose around his neck, tightening with every breath. 12 months of Eleanor scrutinizing his every move. 12 months of second-guessing every phone check, every moment of divided attention. 12 months of proving he deserved to keep a job he'd already excelled at for 5 years. His phone buzzed. A text from Mila's school. Spirit Week schedule attached. Please confirm Mila's participation. Daniel stared at the message, then at the chapel's stained glass window where abstract shapes formed something that might have been a dove, or an angel, or just colored light playing tricks on tired eyes. He typed back, confirmed, she'll participate in everything. Because, damn it, his daughter was going to have crazy hair day and character day and all the normal, beautiful experiences of childhood. She was going to know that her father showed up, kept promises, made things work even when the world tried to break them. Eleanor Graves could document every phone check. She could make his life miserable for the next 12 months. But she couldn't take away the fact that he was Mila's father, and that role, that sacred, exhausting, wonderful role, would always come first. At 11:30, Daniel made his way to the pediatric ICU. The unit was bustling with the organized chaos of shift change. Night nurses giving report to day staff, doctors making rounds, families keeping vigil by bedsides. He nodded to colleagues as he passed, accepting their casual greetings without stopping to chat. In the locker room, he found Marcus Webb, one of the unit's veteran nurses, pulling on his jacket after completing the night shift. Dan, there you are. Marcus's usual jovial expression faded when he saw Daniel's face. Rough morning? HR meeting. Daniel opened his locker and began organizing his supplies for the shift. Eleanor's building her case. Marcus cursed under his breath. That woman's got ice in her veins. What happened? Performance improvement plan. 12 months probation for checking on my kid. You're kidding me. Marcus sat down heavily on the bench. 17 times in 6 months? That's what she's basing this on? Apparently consistency matters more than context. Consistency. Marcus shook his head in disgust. You know what's consistent? You saving the Martinez kid last month when he coded. You training every new nurse who comes through here. You working every holiday so the rest of us can see our families. He paused. Elena's been a nurse for 22 years, and she's never met anyone better in crisis situations than you. She says you're the only person she'd want caring for her grandkids if they were ever in the ICU. The words settled something in Daniel's chest. He'd been so focused on Eleanor's accusations that he'd forgotten the other voices, the ones that saw him clearly, that valued what he brought to this place. Thanks, Marcus. I needed to hear that. It's the truth. Marcus stood and clapped Daniel on the shoulder. Eleanor Graves is temporary. She'll move on to terrorize some other department eventually. But you're essential here. Don't let her make you forget that. After Marcus left, Daniel stood alone in the locker room, staring at his reflection in the small mirror attached to his locker door. He looked tired, worn, but not defeated. Not yet. At noon precisely, he clocked in and received his patient assignment from the charge nurse. Room 407, Emma Reeves, 8 years old, recovering from emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix. Room 409, Lucas Chen, 5 years old, post-op day 2 from a kidney transplant. Room 412, Maya Washington, 6 years old, pneumonia complicated by asthma. 3 children. 3 families depending on him to be present, competent, compassionate. Daniel reviewed their charts, memorized their medication schedules, and introduced himself to their parents with the calm professionalism that had become second nature. Emma's mother looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. Lucas's parents were immigrants, their English limited, but their gratitude boundless. Maya's grandmother was raising her alone, a mirror of Daniel's own situation that made his chest tight. She's in good hands, he told Maya's grandmother, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of ICU nursing, medication rounds, vital sign checks, wound care, documentation. Daniel moved between rooms with practiced efficiency, his hands steady, his mind focused. When Emma's post-op pain spiked, he caught it early and adjusted her medication before she suffered needlessly. When Lucas's parents struggled to understand the transplant coordinator's instructions, Daniel sat with them for 20 minutes, explaining everything in simple terms until comprehension dawned in their eyes. This was why he'd become a nurse, not for the policies or the politics or the performance metrics. For these moments, when skill and compassion combined to ease suffering, when he could be the person he desperately needed during Jessica's final days. At 2:47 p.m., his phone buzzed in his pocket. He was between patients, charting at the nurse's station, and technically on a break. According to Eleanor's rules, this should have been acceptable. But Daniel hesitated, hyper-aware that she could be watching, documenting, adding to her evidence. The phone buzzed again, then again. Daniel glanced around the unit. Eleanor wasn't visible. Neither were any supervisors who might report back to her. He pulled out his phone. 3 texts from an unknown number. Hi, this is Sarah Martinez, Emma's mother from room 407. The school gave me your number. Mila fell on the playground, hit her head. They're taking her to the ER now. She's asking for you. The world tilted sideways. Daniel read the messages again, his brain refusing to process the words. Mila. ER. Head injury. His daughter was hurt, and he was here, 20 minutes away, trapped by policies and probation and Eleanor Graves' surveillance. He was on his feet before conscious thought kicked in, already moving toward the charge nurse's station. Lisa Chen looked up from her computer, saw his face, and immediately stood. What happened? My daughter. ER. Head injury. The words came out clipped, mechanical, his mind already calculating logistics. I need coverage, now. Lisa didn't hesitate. Go. I'll handle it. I have 3 patients. I know your patients. Go, Daniel. We've got this. He was already running, his badge clattering against his chest, his phone clutched in his hand. The elevator took an eternity. The parking garage stretched endlessly. His car wouldn't start fast enough, wouldn't drive fast enough, would never get him to his daughter in time. Traffic lights mocked him. Speed limits became suggestions. Every second that passed was a second Mila was scared, hurt, asking for him while he wasn't there. Sarah Martinez's next text came through as he pulled into the ER parking lot. "We're in Bay 6. She's okay, just scared. They're doing a CT scan." Just scared. As if fear was a small thing. As if Mila's terror didn't matter because the injury might not be serious. Daniel abandoned his car in the first space he found and sprinted toward the ER entrance. The automatic doors seemed to open in slow motion. The triage nurse recognized him. They'd worked together before his transfer to pediatrics and waved him through without the usual check-in. "Bay 6, Dan. She's with Dr. Patel." He navigated the familiar chaos of the ER, dodging gurneys and families and staff, until he reached Bay 6. The curtain was partially open, and through it he could see Mila lying on an exam table, Sarah Martinez holding her hand, a CT tech preparing the imaging equipment. Mila's face was tear-streaked and pale, a darkening bruise spreading across her left temple. But she was conscious, alert, and when she saw him, her whole face crumpled. "Daddy!" Daniel was at her side in an instant, gathering her into his arms as carefully as he could manage while his heart was trying to beat its way out of his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed, not the quiet, controlled crying of a child trying to be brave, but the raw, desperate tears of a 7-year-old who'd been terrified and is finally safe. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're okay." He repeated it like a mantra, feeling her small body shake against his. Over her head, he met Sarah Martinez's eyes. "Thank you," he mouthed. Sarah nodded, her own eyes wet. "I was chaperoning the field day, saw it happen. She was on the monkey bars, slipped, hit her head on the landing, lost consciousness for maybe 10 seconds, so they called the ambulance. School couldn't reach you. Your number went straight to voicemail." Because he'd been in that damn HR meeting with his phone on silent. Because Eleanor Graves had been lecturing him about being distracted while his daughter was being loaded into an ambulance. Dr. Patel appeared, a petite woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. "Mr. Cross, good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. We're about to take her back for the CT, standard protocol for head injuries with loss of consciousness." "Is she—" Daniel's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What are we looking at?" "Likely a mild concussion. The CT is precautionary to rule out intracranial bleeding or skull fracture. Her vitals are stable, neurological responses are appropriate for her age. I'm optimistic, but we need to be thorough." Mila pulled back from Daniel's shoulder, her eyes wide and frightened. "Is my brain broken?" Despite everything, the fear, the stress, the complete collapse of his carefully managed day, Daniel felt his lips curve into a small smile. "No, sweetheart. Your brain is perfect. They just want to take some special pictures to make absolutely sure everything's working exactly like it should." "Will it hurt?" "Not even a little. You just have to lie very still while the machine takes pictures. Can you do that?" Mila nodded solemnly, then winced. "My head hurts." "I know, baby. We're going to fix that." He looked at Dr. Patel. "Can I go back with her?" "For positioning, yes. You'll need to step out during the actual scan, radiation protocol, but you can be right there before and after." They wheeled Mila to radiology, Daniel walking alongside the gurney with his hand wrapped around hers. She squeezed his fingers tightly, and he squeezed back, their secret code, 3 pulses that meant, "I love you." The CT scan took 11 minutes. Daniel paced the hallway outside, checking his phone compulsively, even though there was no one to call, nothing to do except wait. He had 7 missed calls from the hospital, probably Lisa trying to check on him, and 1 new text from an unknown number. He opened it. "This is Eleanor Graves. You left your shift without following proper protocol. We need to discuss this immediately. Report to my office when you return." Daniel stared at the message, feeling something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. He'd left his shift. He'd abandoned his patients. No, Lisa had covered them. They were fine, but Eleanor wouldn't see it that way. She'd see only the infraction, the violation, the perfect excuse to enforce the consequences she'd been waiting to deliver. The performance improvement plan had lasted exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. He was going to lose his job, not for being a bad nurse, but for being exactly the father Mila needed him to be. The radiology tech emerged. "All done. Dr. Patel will review the images and meet you back in Bay 6. But Daniel returned to find Mila sitting up, looking slightly less terrified. Sarah Martinez had bought her a juice box from the vending machine, and Mila was sipping it carefully while trying not to move her head. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked, resuming his position at her side. "Dizzy, and my head still hurts." "That's normal with a bump like you got. But it'll get better, I promise." 20 minutes later, Dr. Patel returned with results. CT is clear. No bleeding, no fractures. Diagnosis is a mild concussion, which means rest and monitoring for the next 24 to 48 hours. Wake her every few hours tonight to check responsiveness. No screens, minimal physical activity for at least a week. Follow up with her pediatrician in 3 days. Relief made Daniel's knees weak. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "She'll be fine." Dr. Patel squeezed his shoulder. "You did good getting here so fast. She needed her dad." The words echoed in his mind as he carried Mila to the car. Sarah had thoughtfully arranged for another parent to drive Mila's backpack and belongings home. She needed her dad. That fundamental truth that Eleanor Graves couldn't seem to comprehend. The drive home was quiet. Mila dozed in her car seat, exhausted from fear and pain and the adrenaline crash. Daniel drove carefully, protectively, one eye constantly flicking to the rearview mirror to confirm she was still breathing, still okay, still his. It was 4:47 p.m. when they reached the apartment. Daniel carried Mila inside and settled her on the couch with pillows and blankets, turning on her favorite gentle music instead of TV per doctor's orders. He made her toast and brought ice for her head, moving through the familiar motions of caregiving with hands that still shook slightly. Only when she was comfortable, medicated with children's ibuprofen, and drowsing peacefully did Daniel allow himself to look at his phone. 11 missed calls, 4 text messages, all from the hospital. The final text, sent at 4:15 p.m., was from Eleanor. "Your continued absence is being treated as job abandonment. Final warning, report immediately or face termination." Daniel sat on the floor beside the couch where his daughter slept and let his head fall back against the cushions. He'd known this was coming, had known from the moment he ran out of the unit that Eleanor would use it against him. But knowing didn't make it easier. He thought about calling, explaining, begging for understanding. But what would be the point? Eleanor had already decided who he was, a distracted employee who put personal concerns above professional obligations. Nothing he said would change that narrative. His phone rang. Lisa Chen's number. "Daniel? Oh, thank God. Are you okay? Is Mila okay?" "She's okay. Mild concussion. We just got home." "And you're okay?" The question made something crack in his chest. "No, not really. Not. Eleanor's going to fire me, isn't she?" "She's trying to." Lisa's voice turned hard. "But the rest of us aren't letting her." "We all signed a statement explaining what happened, that it was a genuine emergency, that you followed protocol by notifying the charge nurse, that patient care wasn't compromised. Marcus came in on his day off to deliver it to her personally. And Dr. Morrison backed us up." Dr. Morrison, the pediatric ICU's medical director and Eleanor's supervisor. What did he say? That any nurse who prioritizes a child with a head injury over bureaucratic procedure is exactly the kind of nurse this unit needs, and that if Eleanor pursues termination, he'll fight it. Daniel closed his eyes, overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, we did. You're one of us, Dan. We take care of our own." Lisa paused. "Eleanor's backed off for now, but she's not happy. You need to come in tomorrow and face her. Don't give her any excuse to claim job abandonment." "I'll be there." After they hung up, Daniel sat in the dimming apartment and watched his daughter sleep. Her face was peaceful now, the bruise on her temple the only evidence of the day's trauma. She'd been hurt and scared, and he'd been there. He'd chosen her without hesitation, exactly as a father should. And his colleagues, people who understood that nursing wasn't just a job but a calling that sometimes required impossible choices, had chosen him. Eleanor Graves could document every infraction, enforce every policy, build her case with meticulous care. But she couldn't erase the fundamental truth that Daniel Cross was both an excellent nurse and a devoted father, and those two identities weren't contradictory. They were inseparable. Tomorrow, he'd face Eleanor again. Tomorrow, he'd defend his choices again. Tomorrow, he'd probably sign more paperwork, endure more lectures, except more restrictions on his already restricted life. But tonight, he'd sit beside his daughter and be grateful that when she needed him most, he'd been exactly where he belonged. Daniel woke Mila every 2 hours through the night, as instructed. Each time, he'd gently shake her shoulder and ask the same questions. "What's your name? How old are you? Where are you?" She answered correctly every time, though her voice grew increasingly annoyed around 2 a.m. when she mumbled, "Daddy, I know who I am. Can I please just sleep?" By morning, Daniel had slept perhaps 90 minutes total, his body running on pure adrenaline and the bitter coffee he'd brewed at 5 a.m. Mila's bruise had darkened to a spectacular purple blue, spreading from her temple down to her cheekbone. She looked like she'd been in a fight, and in a way, she had. Gravity always won against 7-year-olds on monkey bars. At 6:30, Daniel called Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, and explained the situation. She arrived within 10 minutes, her wrinkled face creased with concern as she examined Mila's injury. "Poor little dumpling," she murmured, stroking Mila's hair. "You just rest today. We'll watch cooking shows and I'll make you my special soup." "No screens," Daniel reminded her gently. "Doctor's orders, concussion protocol. Then we listen to audiobooks and I teach her to knit. Go, Daniel. Do what you must do. We'll be fine here." Daniel kissed Mila's forehead, careful to avoid the bruise. "I'll be home as soon as I can. You listen to Mrs. Chen, okay?" "Will you lose your job?" Mila asked suddenly, her eyes too knowing for a child who should have been worrying about nothing more serious than spelling tests. The question gutted him. "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we'll be okay. I promise." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he made it anyway, because that's what parents did. They lied about certainties when the truth was too terrifying for small ears. The drive to St. Catherine's felt like driving toward an execution. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles ached. He dressed carefully in his cleanest scrubs, shaved precisely, done everything he could to present himself as the consummate professional. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Eleanor had her narrative, and yesterday's emergency had given her exactly the evidence she needed to complete it. He arrived at 7:42 a.m., 18 minutes before his scheduled shift. The parking garage was already filling with the morning rush of staff changeover. Daniel sat in his car for a moment, gathering his composure, trying to find the calm center he used when walking into a patient's room to deliver bad news. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "We're with you. Whatever happens in there, remember that." Then one from Lisa. "Room 407 when you're ready, staff meeting." Daniel frowned. He wasn't scheduled for any staff meeting, unless Eleanor had arranged something, some public forum to make an example of him. The thought made his stomach churn, but he locked his car and headed inside anyway. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt interminable. When the doors opened, Daniel stepped into the pediatric ICU and immediately sensed something different. The usual morning chaos was subdued. Nurses clustered in small groups, their conversations dying when they saw him. Not hostile, supportive, if their expressions were any indication. Several offered small nods or tentative smiles. Lisa appeared at his elbow. "Conference room, now. Eleanor's already there, and so is Dr. Morrison." "What's going on?" "You'll see. Come on." The conference room was packed. Daniel counted 12 nurses, 3 physicians, including Dr. Morrison, 2 respiratory therapists, and Eleanor Graves sitting at the head of the table with her spine rigid and her expression thunderous. An empty chair sat across from her, clearly meant for him. Daniel took the seat, his heart hammering. Whatever this was, it wasn't what he'd expected. Dr. Morrison stood. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm authority that came from 30 years of pediatric medicine. "Mr. Cross, thank you for joining us. I know you've had a difficult 24 hours. "Yes, sir." "How's your daughter?" The question surprised him. "Mild concussion. She'll recover fully." "I'm glad to hear it." Dr. Morrison glanced at Eleanor, then back to Daniel. "We're here this morning because yesterday's events have brought some issues to light that need addressing. Ms. Graves has filed a formal complaint regarding your departure from your shift without following proper protocol." Daniel's mouth went dry. "I notified the charge nurse." Dr. Morrison held up a hand. "I'm aware. I've reviewed the timeline. Your daughter was injured at 2:34 p.m. You received notification at 2:47 p.m. You informed Nurse Chen and departed at 2:51 p.m. Nurse Chen immediately redistributed your patient load, and there was no lapse in care for any of your assigned patients. He paused. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. Then I fail to see the protocol violation. Dr. Morrison turned to Eleanor. Miss Graves, perhaps you can enlighten me. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Hospital policy states that staff members must receive supervisor approval before leaving their shifts early. Mr. Cross did not contact me or any other supervisor. He informed a charge nurse and left. That's not proper protocol. The charge nurse is the appropriate person to notify in emergency situations, Dr. Morrison countered. That's been standard practice in this unit for as long as I've worked here. Standard practice isn't written policy. Written policy requires that patient care not be compromised, and it wasn't. Dr. Morrison's tone hardened. What it sounds like, Miss Graves, is that you're upset you weren't personally notified. But I have to ask, if Mr. Cross had taken the time to track you down while his 7-year-old daughter was in the emergency room with a head injury, what exactly would you have said? The room was silent. Every eye turned to Eleanor, waiting. She seemed to choose her words carefully. I would have evaluated the situation and determined the appropriate course of action. Which would have been? That depends on the severity of the injury and the availability of coverage. Marcus spoke up from the back of the room, his voice tight with controlled anger. With all due respect, ma'am, are you saying you would have considered denying a father access to his injured child based on staffing levels? I'm saying there are procedures. There are children, Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp. That's what we're here for. Not procedures, not policies, not bureaucratic boxes to check. We're here to care for children and support the people who care for them. And that includes our staff members' children. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her expression remained defiant. Rules exist for a reason, Dr. Morrison. If we allow everyone to leave whenever family issues arise, yesterday wasn't a family issue. It was a medical emergency involving a minor child who lost consciousness. Dr. Morrison leaned forward. Let me be very clear, Ms. Graves. If you had been in Mr. Cross's position, I would have expected you to do exactly what he did. And if you're telling me you wouldn't have, that you would have prioritized checking boxes over your child's welfare, then I have serious concerns about your judgment. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Daniel sat frozen, barely breathing, unable to believe what he was hearing. Eleanor's hands trembled as she shuffled her papers. This isn't about what I would do. It's about Mr. Cross's pattern of behavior, the phone checks, the distractions, the repeated prioritization of personal matters. The repeated dedication to his daughter's safety, Lisa interjected, which, frankly, is what makes him so good with our patients. He understands what these parents are going through because he lives it every day. I've reviewed Mr. Cross's personnel file, Dr. Morrison said. Every commendation, every patient outcome, every peer evaluation. Do you know what I found? One of the best nurses this unit has ever had. A man who volunteers for the shifts no one else wants, who trains new staff with patience and skill, who has successfully managed some of our most critical cases. He paused. I also found 2 written warnings for checking his phone 17 times in 6 months, less than 3 times per month. And when I looked at the documented instances, every single one occurred during designated break time or between patient care activities. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. The policy doesn't distinguish between break time and work time. It says no personal device usage during working hours. Then the policy is poorly written and needs revision, Dr. Morrison said flatly. Which brings me to why we're all here. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. I want to hear from the staff. What do you think about the current personal device policy? There was a moment of hesitation. Then Marcus stood. It's unreasonable. We're all adults with lives and responsibilities outside this hospital. Emergencies happen. Children get sick. Elderly parents fall, cars break down. Expecting us to be completely unreachable for 12-hour shifts is unrealistic and, frankly, cruel. Sarah Nguyen, one of the newer nurses, spoke next. I have a diabetic mother who lives alone. I need to be able to check on her. The policy says I can't, but if I don't and something happens... Her voice trailed off. Others chimed in, one after another, sharing their own struggles with the rigid policy. A nurse with a special needs child who required frequent coordination with therapists. A respiratory therapist whose husband had early onset Alzheimer's. A physician whose teenager struggled with severe anxiety and needed periodic reassurance during school hours. The common thread was clear. Everyone had someone they loved, someone they worried about, someone they needed to be able to reach. The policy that demanded absolute separation between professional and personal lives didn't reflect the reality of human existence. Daniel watched Eleanor's face as the testimonials piled up. Something was shifting in her expression, the rigid certainty cracking, revealing something underneath that looked almost like pain. When the room finally quieted, Dr. Morrison turned back to Eleanor. "Miss Graves, I'm going to be direct. The performance improvement plan you've placed Mr. Cross on is being rescinded. The written warnings in his file will be expunged, and we're going to form a committee to revise the personal device policy into something that balances patient safety with basic human compassion. I'd like you to chair that committee." Eleanor's head snapped up. "I don't think that's appropriate." "I do. You clearly care about maintaining standards and protocols. That's valuable. But you need to learn to apply those standards with understanding of context. This committee will teach you that." Dr. Morrison's tone softened slightly. "Consider it a learning opportunity, not a punishment." The meeting was dismissed. Staff filtered out in small groups, several stopping to squeeze Daniel's shoulder or murmur words of support. Lisa hugged him outright, whispering, "Told you we had your back." Daniel remained seated, overwhelmed. In less than 24 hours, he'd gone from certain termination to complete vindication. It felt surreal, like he might wake up and discover this was just wishful thinking. Eleanor hadn't moved either. She sat at the head of the table, staring at her perfectly organized papers as the room emptied. Finally, only she and Daniel remained. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Daniel considered leaving, but something kept him in his chair. Maybe it was the expression on Eleanor's face. No longer harsh or judgmental, but lost, almost broken. "Ms. Graves," he said quietly, "are you all right?" She looked up sharply, as if surprised he was still there. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because you look like I felt yesterday when I got the call about Mila, like your world just tilted sideways." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "My world has been tilted for quite some time, Mr. Cross." She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, and without them she looked older, more fragile. "I owe you an apology." Daniel waited. "I've been unfair to you, unreasonably harsh. I told myself it was about maintaining standards, but..." She paused, choosing words carefully. "The truth is more complicated." "What is the truth?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mother has Alzheimer's, advanced stage. She's in a memory care facility 20 minutes from here." She met his eyes. "I check on her constantly. The staff texts me updates throughout the day, what she ate, whether she recognized them, if she's having a good day or a bad one. Yesterday alone, I checked my phone 37 times. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. "Ms. Graves?" "Eleanor, please," she smiled weakly. "Ms. Graves is the person who's been punishing you for doing exactly what I do. Eleanor is just someone who's terrified and taking it out on the wrong people." Daniel processed this, rearranging everything he thought he knew about his supervisor. "Why didn't you say something? Why enforce a policy you don't even follow yourself?" "Because I'm management. I told myself it was different, that I was senior enough that the rules didn't apply the same way, that my situation was unique." She laughed again, the sound hollow. "I convinced myself that your phone checks were different from mine, that you were distracted while I was just concerned. The hypocrisy is stunning when I say it out loud." "How long has your mother been sick?" 3 years, but she's declined rapidly in the past 6 months, the same 6 months I've been here." Eleanor's hands trembled as she put her glasses back on. "I transferred to St. Catherine's because the facility she's in is nearby. My previous hospital was 40 minutes away and I needed to be closer, in case something happened." "So you understand," Daniel said softly. "You understand exactly what it's like to work while part of your heart is somewhere else, worried." "I do, which makes my treatment of you even more inexcusable." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. I saw myself in you, Mr. Cross. The constant phone checking, the divided attention, the guilt of never being enough in either place. And instead of recognizing a kindred spirit, I punished you for it. Because if I could convince myself that you were unprofessional, then maybe what I was doing wasn't unprofessional either. Maybe it was just necessary. Daniel joined her at the window. It is necessary. Caring about the people we love doesn't make us bad at our jobs. It makes us human. Dr. Morrison made that painfully clear. Eleanor's reflection in the glass showed a woman stripped of her armor, vulnerable and exhausted. He called me into his office yesterday after you left, asked me point blank if I would have denied a parent access to an injured child. I said, of course not. And he said then, why did I have a problem with what you did? I didn't have a good answer. What did you say? Nothing coherent. I tried to talk about protocols and consistency, and he just looked at me like I was speaking another language. She turned to face Daniel directly. Then he asked if I'd left work early last month when the facility called to say my mother had fallen and broken her wrist. I had. And he asked if I'd gotten supervisor approval first or if I'd just told my assistant and left. I just left. The parallel was stark. Daniel could see the realization settling over Eleanor like a weight. So I'm a hypocrite, she continued, her voice brittle. I'm a middle-aged woman who's been so terrified of appearing weak or emotional that I've become cruel. I'm someone who forgot that policies are meant to serve people, not the other way around. She met his eyes. And I'm someone who nearly destroyed a good man's career because I couldn't face my own contradictions. The apology in her words was unmistakable, but Daniel sensed there was more she needed to say. He waited, giving her space. My husband left 2 years ago, Eleanor said quietly. Said he couldn't handle watching my mother deteriorate, couldn't handle me being consumed by her care. He wanted his wife back, he said, as if I could just choose to stop being a daughter. She laughed bitterly. So I threw myself into work, became hypervigilant about everything I could control because so much of my life was out of control. And when I saw you, young, dedicated, doing everything right but still struggling, I saw what I might have been if I'd made different choices, if I'd fought harder for balance instead of rigid control. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the ice-cold supervisor who'd threatened his livelihood. This was a woman drowning in the same impossible choices he faced every day, just with different variables. I'm sorry about your mother, he said, and your husband. That's a lot to carry alone. So is raising a daughter while working full-time as a nurse. But I didn't see that, or I didn't want to see it. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, some of her professional composure returning. Dr. Morrison was right to put me on that committee. I need to learn to lead with compassion instead of fear. And I need to understand that the best policies are the ones that acknowledge people's full humanity, not demand they compartmentalize it. For what it's worth, Daniel said, I think you're more compassionate than you give yourself credit for. You're here, admitting mistakes. That takes courage. Eleanor smiled sadly. Or desperation. I've been running on fear for so long, I'd forgotten what courage looks like. She extended her hand. Can we start over, mister? Cross, I promise to be a better supervisor if you promise to be patient with me while I figure out how. Daniel shook her hand. Only if you stop calling me Mr. Cross. It's Daniel. Daniel, she tested the name. And you'll call me Eleanor. Eleanor, he agreed. They stood in the conference room, two people who'd been adversaries hours ago, now tentatively allied by the recognition of shared struggle. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Eleanor's actions had caused real harm, real fear, real consequences that couldn't be undone with a single conversation. But it was a beginning. I should check on my patients, Daniel said. I'm technically on shift now. Of course. Go. Eleanor paused. And Daniel? When you need to check on Mila today, I don't want you hiding in a supply closet to do it. Check openly. That's what the policy should have always allowed. Daniel nodded, something tight in his chest loosening slightly. He left the conference room and headed to the nurse's station, where Lisa immediately appeared with a patient update. You've got the same assignments as yesterday, Emma, Lucas, and Maya. Emma's doing better, asking for popsicles. Lucas's parents brought him homemade dumplings, which the nutritionist approved. Maya's grandmother is worried about missing work to stay with her. I'll talk to her, Daniel said. See if social services can help with FMLA paperwork. The day unfolded in familiar rhythms. Daniel moved between patients, administering medications, changing dressings, charting progress. But something was different. He wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder, wasn't second-guessing every moment he glanced at his phone, wasn't carrying the weight of Eleanor's surveillance. At 10:30, he received a text from Mrs. Chen with a photo of Mila attempting to knit, her tongue poking out in concentration as she wrestled with needles and yarn. The bruise on her face was visible, but she was smiling. Daniel showed the photo to Emma's mother, who'd been asking about his daughter after hearing about the accident. She looks like a fighter, Emma's mother said warmly, just like her dad. At noon, Daniel took his lunch break in the staff lounge. Marcus joined him, bringing coffee and a sandwich he'd picked up from the cafeteria. Hell of a morning, Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Daniel. Never seen Dr. Morrison that fired up. Eleanor looked like she'd been hit by a truck. She's dealing with her own stuff, Daniel said. Her mother has Alzheimer's. Marcus's eyebrows rose. That explains some things. Still doesn't excuse how she treated you, but it explains it. She apologized, acknowledged she was wrong. Daniel took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. I think she's trying to do better. You're more forgiving than I'd be, Daniel shrugged. 5 years ago, I was angry at the world. Angry at the doctors who couldn't save Jessica, angry at myself for not noticing her symptoms sooner, angry at every policy and bureaucracy that stood between me and taking care of my daughter. That anger didn't help anything. It just made me bitter. So you're just letting it go. I'm choosing to believe people can change when they're given the chance. Eleanor made mistakes, but she owned them. That's more than a lot of people do. Daniel met Marcus's eyes. Besides, holding on to resentment takes energy I don't have. I'd rather put that energy into being there for Mila. Marcus nodded slowly. You're a better man than most, Dan. I'm just a tired man who wants to keep his job and raise his kid. Everything else is negotiable. The afternoon brought new challenges. Lucas developed a low-grade fever that needed monitoring. Maya's oxygen saturation dropped and required respiratory therapy intervention. Emma's pain management needed adjustment. Daniel handled each situation with the calm competence he'd honed over years. His mind fully present for his patients, even as part of his awareness tracked the time, counting down to 3:15 when he could pick up Mila. At 2:30, Eleanor appeared in the ICU. Daniel tensed instinctively, old habits dying hard, but she merely nodded at him and began making rounds to check on patients. She spoke quietly with families, reviewed charts, consulted with physicians. The hypervigilant surveillance Daniel had grown accustomed to was absent. She was simply doing her job. When she finished rounds, she stopped at the nurse's station where Daniel was charting. How's your daughter? Much better. Mrs. Chen sent a photo of her learning to knit. That's good. I'm glad. Eleanor hesitated, then added, I spoke with Dr. Morrison about restructuring the personal device policy. We're going to survey all staff about their needs and concerns before drafting revisions. I'd like you to be on the committee, if you're willing. Daniel considered. Being on the committee meant more meetings, more time away from Mila, more energy devoted to work when he had so little to spare. But it also meant having a voice in creating something better, something that might help the next single parent who walked these halls. I'll do it, he said. On one condition. What's that? Meetings happen during regular work hours, not before or after shifts. I can't afford extra childcare. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile, not the tight professional mask she usually wore. Agreed. I'll make sure of it. At 3:05, Daniel clocked out. His replacement, a competent nurse named Jennifer, had already received report on all 3 patients. Everything was in order. He grabbed his bag from his locker and headed to his car, feeling lighter than he had in months. The drive to Oakwood Elementary took the usual 12 minutes. Daniel pulled into the pickup line at 3:14, 1 minute early, and watched children stream from the building. Mila emerged with Mrs. Chen, moving slowly and carefully, one hand pressed to her head. When she saw Daniel's car, her face lit up. She climbed into the back seat, and he noticed she'd decorated her bruise with a temporary tattoo, a small butterfly perched on her temple. Mrs. Chen let me put a butterfly on my owie, Mila announced. She said butterflies mean transformation, that my owie is transforming me into someone stronger. Daniel met Mrs. Chen's eyes in the rearview mirror. The old woman smiled and patted Mila's shoulder. Strong girls become strong women. This little one will be magnificent. After dropping Mrs. Chen at her apartment with profuse thanks, Daniel drove Mila home. She chattered about the audiobook they'd listened to, something about dragons and brave children, and her attempt at knitting, which had resulted in what she called a lumpy scarf for a very small, very cold mouse. "Can we have spaghetti for dinner?" she asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. "We can have anything you want, sweetheart." Inside, Daniel started dinner while Mila rested on the couch, her butterfly-decorated bruise a reminder of how quickly life could change. Yesterday, he'd thought he was losing everything. Today, he had his job, his dignity, and the beginning of real change at the hospital. But more importantly, he had this, his daughter safe at home, asking for spaghetti, transforming her injury into a story about butterflies. The pasta water was boiling when his phone rang. Eleanor's number. Daniel answered with trepidation. "Hello?" "Daniel, I'm sorry to call after hours. I wanted to let you know that the committee's first meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday at 1 p.m. in the conference room. It'll be during your shift, as we discussed." "Okay, I'll be there." "There's something else." Eleanor's voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. "I went to see my mother after work today. I told her about what happened, about you, about the meeting, about my own hypocrisy. She didn't understand most of it. She thought I was my sister, actually, but when I was leaving, she grabbed my hand and said, 'Be kind, sweetheart. It's the only thing that matters.'" Eleanor paused, and Daniel heard her take a shaky breath. "She hasn't had a lucid moment in weeks. But somehow, today, she gave me exactly the advice I needed. So I wanted to pass it along to you too. Be kind, even when you have every reason not to be. You were kind to me this morning when I didn't deserve it. That mattered." "We all deserve kindness, Eleanor, especially when we're struggling. Thank you for believing that." She cleared her throat. "Enjoy your evening with Mila. I'll see you Tuesday." After she hung up, Daniel stood in his small kitchen, stirring pasta sauce, thinking about transformation. Mila's bruise would heal, fading from purple to yellow to gone, leaving her stronger for having survived the fall. Eleanor was changing too, letting vulnerability crack open her rigid exterior, learning to lead with compassion instead of control. And Daniel himself was transforming, learning that standing up for what was right didn't always lead to disaster. Sometimes it led to understanding. Sometimes it created space for others to admit their own struggles. Sometimes it changed systems that desperately needed changing. "Daddy," Mila called from the couch. "Is dinner ready? I'm starving." "Almost, sweetheart. 5 more minutes." Daniel drained the pasta and mixed it with sauce, adding extra Parmesan the way Mila liked. He carried 2 plates to the coffee table and they ate together, Mila recounting every detail of her day with Mrs. Chen while Daniel listened and smiled and felt profoundly grateful. After dinner, they played a quiet board game. Doctor's orders meant no screens or active play. And Mila won 3 times in a row, celebrating each victory with gentle fist pumps that didn't jostle her head. At bedtime, Daniel helped her brush her teeth and change into pajamas, then tucked her into bed with her elephant. He sat on the edge of her mattress, running his fingers through her hair. "Daddy?" Mila's voice was sleepy. "Are you still going to lose your job?" "No, sweetheart, I'm not. Everything's okay now." "Because of my owie?" Daniel smiled. "Because sometimes when scary things happen, they help people understand what's really important. My boss realized that being a good daddy and being a good nurse aren't different things. They're the same thing." Mila considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "So my owie helped?" "Your owie helped me be brave enough to tell the truth. And the truth helped people understand." "Then I'm glad I fell," Mila declared, "even though it hurt a lot." "I'm not glad you fell," Daniel corrected gently, "but I'm glad something good came from something scary. That's called making the best of a bad situation. Like putting butterflies on owies. Exactly like that." He kissed her forehead, turned on her nightlight, and left the door cracked open the way she needed. In the hallway, Daniel leaned against the wall and let himself feel the full weight of the past 48 hours. He'd walked into that HR meeting expecting the worst and had instead found vindication. He'd faced Eleanor's accusations and responded not with anger, but with calm truth. He'd chosen his daughter without hesitation and been supported for it. He'd seen his harshest critic transform into someone capable of admitting fault and seeking change. None of it had been easy. None of it had followed the script he'd feared, but all of it had reinforced a truth Daniel had always known but hadn't always trusted, that doing the right thing, even when it was terrifying, even when it risked everything, was still worth doing. Because Mila was watching, learning, building her understanding of how the world worked based on what she saw her father do. And Daniel wanted her to learn that principles mattered, that compassion was strength, that standing up for yourself and others wasn't just noble, it was necessary. He wanted her to grow up knowing that her father had fought for her, always, without apology or hesitation. That when she'd needed him, he'd come. That love wasn't something you squeezed into the margins of policy and protocol. It was the foundation everything else was built on. Daniel returned to the kitchen to clean up the dinner dishes. Through the window, he could see lights in other apartments, other families settling into their evening routines, each one fighting their own battles, carrying their own burdens, making impossible choices between competing obligations. Tomorrow, he'd go back to work. He'd care for sick children and support their frightened parents. He'd attend the committee meeting and help draft policies that recognized human complexity. He'd continue building a life that honored both his professional calling and his role as Mila's father. But tonight, he'd simply be grateful. Grateful for colleagues who'd stood up for him. Grateful for a supervisor who'd found the courage to admit fault. Grateful for a daughter who turned injuries into butterfly stories. Grateful for one more day of keeping his promises, maintaining his dignity, and proving that being both a nurse and a father wasn't a contradiction. It was who he was. And finally, after years of feeling judged for it, that truth was being recognized and valued. Daniel finished the dishes, made Mila's lunch for tomorrow, and laid out her clothes for school. Then he sat on the couch in their small apartment and allowed himself to imagine a future where he didn't live in constant fear of losing everything, where checking on his daughter wasn't a fireable offense, where policies were written with compassion and enforced with understanding. It wasn't guaranteed. Eleanor could backslide. The committee could fail. Hospital administration could reject their recommendations. But for the first time in a very long time, Daniel felt hope. And hope, he was learning, was its own kind of transformation. The days that followed carried a strange new rhythm. Daniel went to work each morning with something he hadn't felt in months: the absence of dread. He still checked his phone when Mila texted, still coordinated her care between shifts, still lived the precarious balancing act of single parenthood. But now when he pulled out his phone between patient rounds, he didn't scan the unit for Eleanor's disapproving gaze. He simply checked his messages, responded if necessary, and returned to work. The difference was profound. It was the difference between surviving and living. Mila's bruise faded from deep purple to greenish yellow over the course of a week, the butterfly tattoo wearing away until only faint discoloration remained. She returned to school with a doctor's note clearing her for regular activities, and Daniel returned to sleeping more than 90 minutes a night, the constant vigilance finally easing. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel attended the first committee meeting. Eleanor had assembled a diverse group, nurses from different departments, a physician, a social worker, and a representative from HR. They sat around the conference table with coffee and notepads, their faces reflecting varying degrees of skepticism and hope. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, and Daniel noticed she looked different, less armored. Her usual severe bun had softened into a looser style, and she'd traded her typical rigid blazer for a cardigan. Small changes, but they signaled something shifting beneath the surface. "Thank you all for being here," Eleanor began. "We're gathered to revise the personal device usage policy, not to eliminate accountability, but to create guidelines that recognize the reality of people's lives while maintaining patient safety standards." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation. "I've surveyed staff across all departments. The responses were illuminating. 83% of employees reported checking personal devices during shifts. 96% said these checks were related to caregiving responsibilities: children, elderly parents, disabled family members. Only 4% admitted to social media or non-essential usage. Marcus leaned forward. So basically, everyone's violating the policy, but almost everyone has legitimate reasons. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed, which suggests the policy itself is the problem, not the people breaking it. She advanced to the next slide, showing a breakdown of emergency types: sick children requiring pickup, elderly parents needing medical decisions, school notifications requiring immediate response, childcare cancellations demanding backup arrangements. The data painted a picture of responsible adults managing complex lives, not distracted employees playing on their phones. Our goal, Eleanor continued, is to draft a policy that distinguishes between essential communication and inappropriate usage. We need clear guidelines that protect patient care without punishing people for being human. Sarah Nguyen, the nurse with the diabetic mother, raised her hand. How do we define essential without creating loopholes people abuse? That's the challenge, Eleanor acknowledged. I propose we focus on behavior rather than rigid rules. Instead of saying no phones ever, we say phones used responsibly during appropriate times. We define what responsible means between patients, during scheduled breaks, not while administering medications or performing procedures. We emphasize that patient care always comes first, but acknowledge that brief, necessary personal communication doesn't compromise that care. Daniel spoke up. What about documentation? The current policy created this culture of hiding and fear. People were afraid to be seen checking their phones even during legitimate breaks. We need something that removes that fear. Agreed, Eleanor said, meeting his eyes with an expression that might have been respect. I'm proposing we eliminate the documentation requirement for routine checks. If there's a pattern of behavior that genuinely impacts patient care, supervisors address it through normal performance management channels. But we stop tracking every instance as if staff are criminals on parole. The discussion that followed was passionate and productive. They debated specific scenarios, crafted language that balanced flexibility with accountability, argued over details that would affect real lives. Daniel found himself contributing ideas drawn from his own experience, and others listened, not just politely, but genuinely engaged with his perspective. 2 hours later, they had a rough draft. It wasn't perfect, but it was profoundly different from the policy that had nearly cost Daniel his career. It trusted employees to manage their own responsibilities. It recognized that emergencies happened and parents needed to respond. It acknowledged that the best patient care came from whole people, not fragmented ones pretending half their lives didn't exist. This is good work, Eleanor said as the meeting concluded. I'll refine the language and present it to Dr. Morrison next week. Assuming he approves, we'll circulate it to all departments for feedback before final implementation. As people filed out, Eleanor caught Daniel's arm. Can you stay a moment? When they were alone, she pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of an elderly woman with silver hair and a confused smile, sitting in a chair by a window. My mother. I visited her this morning before work. She didn't know who I was, but she kept telling me I had kind eyes. Daniel studied the photo, seeing the resemblance in the bone structure, the shape of the smile. She's beautiful. She was a teacher for 40 years. Tough as nails, didn't suffer fools. She raised me to believe that discipline and structure were the foundations of success. Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. I spent so much time trying to make her proud, trying to be strong and professional and unshakable, and now she can't remember any of it. But you remember, Daniel said gently. You remember who she was, what she taught you. That doesn't disappear just because she forgets. Eleanor nodded, wiping at her eyes with quick, embarrassed movements. I went to see her this morning because yesterday I would have made excuses not to. Yesterday I would have hidden behind work and told myself I'd visit later. But watching what you went through, how you chose Mila without hesitation, it made me realize I've been choosing wrong. Choosing fear over love. Choosing control over presence. It's not too late to choose differently. I'm trying. I called the facility and arranged to have lunch with her 3 times a week. I'm taking the time I used to spend documenting phone violations and spending it with my mother while she's still here, even if she doesn't know me. Eleanor's smile was watery but genuine. Your situation gave me permission to acknowledge my own, so thank you for that. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. You're welcome. And Eleanor? Your mother would be proud of what you're doing. The committee, the policy changes, the courage to admit when you were wrong. That takes the kind of strength she taught you. I hope you're right. The following week brought unexpected developments. Dr. Morrison not only approved the revised policy, but praised it in a hospital-wide email, specifically crediting the committee's work and Eleanor's leadership. The email generated responses from departments across St. Catharines. Most supportive, some skeptical, a few hostile from managers who preferred rigid control over compassionate flexibility. But the tide was shifting. Stories emerged of other staff members who'd been silently struggling, hiding their caregiving responsibilities, living in fear of being caught caring about their families. The new policy gave them permission to be whole people, and the relief was palpable. Daniel experienced it firsthand when he received a text from Mila's school at 10 a.m. on a Thursday. Mila feeling unwell, low-grade fever. Can you arrange pickup? Old Daniel would have panicked, scrambled for coverage, hidden in a supply closet to make frantic calls while watching for Eleanor's surveillance. New Daniel simply walked to the nurse's station, told Lisa he needed to leave for a sick child pickup, confirmed his patients were stable, and left without fear or guilt. He picked up Mila, who had indeed spiked a fever of 100.8, took her home, got her settled with fluids and children's Tylenol, and returned to work 3 hours later. No drama, no accusations, no terror that this single instance would trigger his termination. When he returned to the unit, Eleanor was reviewing charts at the nurse's station. She glanced up as he passed. Is Mila all right? Just a virus, fever's coming down. Good. Emma's been asking for you. She wants to show you the picture she drew. That was it. No interrogation about why it took 3 hours. No demands for documentation. Just the acknowledgement that Daniel had handled a parental responsibility and returned to his professional one, both intact. 2 weeks after the policy change, Eleanor called a staff meeting. Daniel arrived to find the conference room packed with familiar faces, the same nurses and physicians who'd stood up for him in that earlier meeting, plus several others who'd heard about the changes and wanted to participate. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood an elderly woman in a wheelchair, silver-haired and fragile-looking, but with sharp, intelligent eyes that tracked the room with interest. Everyone, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, this is my mother, Catherine. She's having a good day today, and she wanted to meet the people I work with. Catherine smiled warmly at the assembled staff. My Eleanor tells me you're all doing important work, caring for children, caring for each other. That's what matters in this world. Taking care of the vulnerable ones. The room was silent, everyone understanding the profound significance of this moment. Eleanor had hidden her mother's condition for months, ashamed of vulnerability, terrified of appearing weak. Now she was introducing Catherine to her colleagues, claiming both her professional identity and her role as a daughter, refusing to separate them anymore. Marcus started clapping. Within seconds, the entire room joined in. Applause for Catherine, for Eleanor, for the courage it took to show up as a whole person. Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears, but she was smiling. Thank you. My mother taught me many things, but I forgot one of the most important lessons until recently. She used to tell me that true strength isn't pretending you don't need help. It's being brave enough to accept it when it's offered. She looked directly at Daniel. Someone recently demonstrated that kind of strength, and it changed everything. Not just policy, but perspective. So I wanted her to be here today to see what can happen when people choose honesty over hiding. After the meeting, staff members approached Catherine one by one, introducing themselves, sharing brief stories about Eleanor's leadership. Catherine's lucidity wavered occasionally. She called Eleanor by her sister's name twice, forgot where she was once, but her warmth remained constant. She held the hand of every person who approached, told them they had kind faces, thanked them for taking care of the children. Daniel waited until the crowd thinned, then approached with Mila, who'd come to the hospital after school as she sometimes did when Daniel's shift aligned with pickup time. Mrs. Catherine, Daniel said, I'm Daniel Cross. This is my daughter, Mila. Catherine's eyes lit up. Oh, what a beautiful child. Come here, sweetheart. Mila, usually shy with strangers, stepped forward without hesitation. Catherine touched the fading bruise on her temple gently. You had an adventure, didn't you? I fell off the monkey bars, Mila explained seriously. But I'm okay now. My daddy came and got me, and the doctors fixed me up. Of course he did. That's what good fathers do. Catherine looked at Daniel with surprising clarity. Eleanor told me about you. She said you taught her something important about being both strong and soft at the same time. That's a rare gift. Daniel felt his throat tighten. She taught me something too, that people can change when they're given grace. Grace, Catherine repeated, savoring the word. Yes, that's exactly right. We all need more grace in this world. She patted Mila's hand. You take care of your daddy, sweetheart. He's doing important work, but his most important job is being your father. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Mila nodded solemnly. I won't. As they walked away, Eleanor caught up with them in the hallway. Thank you for that. My mother doesn't have many clear moments anymore. It means everything that she got to meet you both during one of them. She's remarkable, Daniel said. You can see where you got your strength. And my stubbornness, Eleanor smiled ruefully. Though I'm learning that stubbornness applied to the right things can be powerful. Speaking of which, I have something to show you. She led them to her office and pulled out a formal document with the hospital logo at the top. Final draft of the new personal device policy. It goes into effect Monday. I wanted you to see it first. Daniel scanned the document. Mila pressed against his side, reading along even though most of the words were beyond her comprehension. The policy was everything they discussed in committee and more. It explicitly recognized caregiving responsibilities, outlined reasonable usage expectations, and, most significantly, included a statement that caring for family members was not incompatible with professional excellence, but rather evidence of the compassion that made healthcare workers effective. It's perfect, Daniel said quietly. It's a start, Eleanor corrected. There's still work to do, but it's a better start than we had before. She hesitated, then added, I'm also proposing a mentorship program for staff with caregiving responsibilities, pairing newer nurses with experienced ones who've navigated similar challenges, building community instead of isolation. You want me to be a mentor? It wasn't a question. If you're willing, I think you have a lot to offer people who are where you were 6 months ago, terrified and alone and convinced they have to choose between their job and their family. Daniel looked down at Mila, who was tracing the hospital logo on the document with one small finger. He thought about all the nights he'd lain awake calculating disaster scenarios, all the fear he'd carried, all the moments he'd felt invisible and judged. If he could spare even one person that suffering, if he could be the support he desperately needed, wasn't that worth whatever time it required? I'll do it, he said. On one condition, Mila gets to help design the program materials. Kids' perspectives matter too. Eleanor's smile was radiant. Deal. We'll make it happen. Over the following months, Daniel watched the changes ripple outward. The mentorship program launched with 12 participants and grew to 30 within weeks. Staff who'd been hiding their caregiving responsibilities began speaking openly about them, finding support and practical solutions from colleagues who understood. The culture of fear that had permeated the unit under Eleanor's initial management transformed into something collaborative and compassionate. Eleanor herself became a different kind of leader. She still maintained high standards and expected professional excellence, but she balanced it with understanding. When a young nurse broke down crying after her son was diagnosed with autism, Eleanor sat with her for an hour, sharing resources and offering flexible scheduling. When a respiratory therapist's father had a stroke, Eleanor personally arranged the shift coverage and sent a care package to the family. She visited Catherine 3 times a week without fail, sometimes bringing colleagues to join them. The visits became opportunities for staff to see their supervisor in her full humanity. Not just the manager who evaluated performance, but the daughter who read aloud to a mother who no longer remembered her name but still responded to the sound of her voice. Daniel found himself growing into his role as mentor. He met with new parents joining the unit, listened to their fears, shared strategies that had worked for him. He normalized the struggle, validated their exhaustion, and consistently reinforced that caring about their children made them better nurses, not worse ones. Mila, true to Eleanor's promise, contributed to the program materials. She drew pictures of her father at work and at home, illustrating that the same hands that started IVs also braided hair, that the same person who administered medications also made pancakes. Her childlike wisdom, that daddies and nurses were both helpers, became the unofficial motto of the program. 6 months after that terrible 3 a.m. email, Daniel arrived at work to find a message from Dr. Morrison requesting a meeting. For a split second, old fear flickered. Had something changed? Was he in trouble again? But he pushed it aside. He'd learned that assuming the worst was no longer necessary. Dr. Morrison's office was warm and cluttered with family photos and medical journals. The physician gestured Daniel to a seat and got straight to the point. I wanted to tell you in person before the official announcement. We're nominating you for the hospital's Excellence in Patient Care Award. The committee reviewed your record, the feedback from families, and your contributions to improving our workplace culture. You're an exceptional nurse, Daniel, and it's time we recognize that formally. Daniel sat stunned. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it when you win. Dr. Morrison smiled. The award comes with a $5,000 bonus and recognition at the annual hospital gala. I hope you'll bring Mila. She's as much a part of your success as anything else. $5,000. The number reverberated through Daniel's mind. That was 10 months of medical debt payments. That was a safety net for emergencies. That was Mila's field trip and new winter coat. And maybe, finally, a small vacation. Their first since Jessica died. Thank you, Daniel managed. This means more than you know. You've earned it. And Daniel, I want you to know that your advocacy changed this hospital. Not just the policy, but the whole approach to how we treat our staff. You reminded us that the best patient care comes from people who are allowed to be fully human. That's a gift. That evening, Daniel picked up Mila from after-school care and took her to their favorite diner, a small place with red vinyl booths and a waitress who knew to bring chocolate milk without being asked. They ordered pancakes for dinner, a rare treat, and Daniel told her about the award. Mila's eyes went wide. You won a prize for being a good nurse? Not yet, but I might. They're considering me. You'll win, Mila said with absolute certainty, because you're the best nurse in the whole world. All the kids you help say so. Daniel's throat tightened. How do you know what they say? Because sometimes when we visit, I hear their mommies and daddies talking. They say you're magic because you make scared kids feel better. She took a bite of pancake, chewing thoughtfully. Is it true? Are you magic? No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who remembers what it feels like to be scared. When your mom was sick, I was so scared I could barely breathe. But the nurses who helped us, they understood that fear. They were kind even when I was difficult, patient even when I asked the same questions over and over. I try to be that for other families, the person I needed when we needed help most. Mila considered this with her characteristic seriousness. So you help people because people helped us? Exactly. That's better than magic, she declared. That's real. 2 weeks later, Daniel received official notification that he'd won the Excellence in Patient Care Award. The news spread through the pediatric ICU like wildfire. Colleagues congratulated him. Families whose children he'd cared for sent cards and messages, and Eleanor organized a small celebration in the break room with cake and genuine joy. You deserve this, Eleanor told him privately, her eyes suspiciously bright. Everything you've been through, everything you've accomplished, this is just recognition of what we all already knew. You're extraordinary. I'm really not, Daniel protested. I'm just a dad trying to do his best at 2 impossible jobs. That's what makes you extraordinary. Most people would have given up or become bitter or stopped fighting. You kept showing up, kept caring, kept believing things could be better. She squeezed his shoulder. And because of that, things are better for all of us. The hospital gala was held on a Saturday evening in late spring. Daniel rented a suit, the first formal wear he'd owned since his wedding, and helped Mila into the dress they'd found at a thrift store, pale blue with white flowers. She looked so grown up suddenly. Her dark hair swept into an elegant style thanks to a YouTube tutorial Daniel had practiced 3 times. They arrived at the banquet hall to find it transformed into something magical. White lights strung across the ceiling, round tables draped in linens, a small orchestra playing soft music. Mila's eyes went wide with wonder. Daddy, it's like a fairy tale. Eleanor appeared in an elegant navy dress, her mother in a wheelchair beside her. Catherine was having a difficult day. Her eyes were unfocused, and she didn't seem to recognize where she was, but she smiled when she saw Mila. What a pretty princess, Catherine murmured. Mila curtsied without being prompted, and Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at the gesture. Thank you for being so kind to my mother. She's nice, Mila said simply. She has soft hands. They sat together at a table near the front, joined by Marcus and Lisa, and several other nurses from the unit. The dinner was lovely, better food than Daniel had eaten in years, but he could barely taste it, too aware of the coming moment when he'd have to stand in front of hundreds of people and accept an award he still didn't quite believe he deserved. When the time came, Dr. Morrison took the stage and began his introduction. He spoke about excellence in patient care, about the qualities that made nurses exceptional, about one individual who embodied everything the award represented. Then he said Daniel's name, and the room erupted in applause. Daniel stood on shaking legs, kissed Mila's forehead, and walked to the stage. The spotlight was blinding, the microphone intimidating, the sea of faces overwhelming. But then he found Mila in the crowd, her face shining with pride, and the fear receded. Dr. Morrison handed him a crystal award and an envelope. Daniel stared at the engraved words. Daniel Cross, Excellence in Patient Care, for extraordinary dedication, compassion, and service. Say a few words, Dr. Morrison prompted gently. Daniel faced the audience, his heart hammering. I'm not great at speeches, but I want to thank everyone who supported me through a very difficult time. 6 months ago, I thought I was going to lose my job for being a single parent. I thought caring about my daughter made me a bad nurse. His voice cracked, but he continued. I was wrong. And the people in this room showed me I was wrong, not by making excuses for me, but by recognizing that being a good parent and a good nurse aren't contradictory. They're connected. He looked at Eleanor, who was wiping tears from her eyes. We changed a policy, but more importantly, we changed a culture. We created space for people to be whole. We acknowledged that the hands that comfort dying children also wipe tears from our own children's faces. And that's not a weakness. It's the foundation of compassion. Daniel held up the award. This doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to every nurse who's ever rushed to the ER because their child was hurt. Every doctor who's taken a call from an elderly parent's nursing home. Every therapist who's rearranged their schedule for a school conference. Every single person who's tried to do right by both their patients and their families and felt torn apart by the impossibility of that balance. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. We spend our days caring for other people's loved ones. We hold hands during hard conversations. We celebrate when children recover and mourn when they don't. We bring our whole hearts to this work. And we should be allowed to bring our whole hearts home too, to the people who need us there. Daniel's voice strengthened. So I accept this award on behalf of every caregiver, professional and personal, who refuses to choose between those roles, who shows up exhausted and scared and still gives everything they have, who believes that love and competence can coexist, and who fights to make that belief reality. He stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause. People were standing, clapping, some crying. Daniel descended from the stage in a daze, making his way back to his table where Mila launched herself into his arms. You did so good, Daddy. Everyone's clapping for you. They're clapping for all of us, sweetheart, for everyone who works hard and loves hard and refuses to apologize for either one. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and handshakes, and people sharing their own stories of struggling to balance professional and personal obligations. A respiratory therapist told Daniel how the new policy had allowed her to attend her daughter's dance recital without fear. A physician shared that he'd finally felt comfortable taking his son to specialist appointments during work hours. Person after person approached to say thank you, to acknowledge that his stand had created space for theirs. Eleanor approached as the gala was winding down. Catherine had fallen asleep in her wheelchair, her head tilted peacefully against the headrest. My mother had a moment of clarity during your speech. She whispered to me, "That's what I taught you, to be strong and soft at the same time." I think she understood, even through the fog, what tonight meant. She should be proud of you, Daniel said. You've transformed yourself in this workplace. That takes incredible courage. I had a good teacher, Eleanor smiled. Someone who showed me that admitting fault and changing course isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. As Daniel and Mila drove home that night, the Crystal Award carefully buckled into the passenger seat, and the $5,000 check burning a hole in his wallet with its promise of security, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle. He'd still be a single parent tomorrow, still juggling impossible schedules and tight finances and the constant low-level worry that came with raising a child alone. But the terror was gone. The fear of being punished for caring, of losing everything because he dared to be both father and nurse, had been replaced with certainty that he belonged exactly where he was. "Daddy?" Mila's sleepy voice came from the back seat. "Are you happy?" Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter, her fancy dress wrinkled and her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "So happy, sweetheart. The happiest I've been in a long time." "Because you won the prize?" "Because I stopped being scared. And because people finally understood what I've always known, that you're the most important thing in my life, and that doesn't make me less professional. It makes me more human." Mila was asleep before they reached home, her head lolling against the car seat. Daniel carried her inside, changed her into pajamas without fully waking her, and tucked her into bed with her elephant. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, marveling at how one small person had given him the strength to stand up for what was right, even when it terrified him. In his own room, Daniel placed the Crystal Award on his dresser, where it caught the moonlight streaming through the window. Tomorrow he'd deposit that check and watch 5 years of crushing debt become manageable. Tomorrow he'd return to work as an award-winning nurse, whose expertise was finally matched by institutional respect. Tomorrow he'd continue mentoring others through similar struggles, building the support system he desperately needed. But tonight, he'd simply rest in the knowledge that the battle he'd fought for recognition, for dignity, for the right to be a whole person, had been won. Not just for himself, but for everyone who came after. Eleanor had been right. Grace was exactly what the world needed more of. Grace for the struggling parent, grace for the overwhelmed caregiver, grace for anyone trying to hold together a life that kept threatening to fall apart. And sometimes, Daniel thought as sleep finally claimed him, grace led to transformation. His transformation, Eleanor's transformation, the hospital's transformation, all born from one terrifying moment when he'd chosen truth over safety and refused to apologize for loving his daughter. That choice had changed everything, and it would keep changing things, rippling outward in ways he couldn't predict but could finally trust would be good. The Monday after the gala, Daniel arrived at work to find a note taped to his locker. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, and uncertain. "Thank you for giving me hope. I'm a new nurse and a new mom, and I was ready to quit. Your speech showed me I don't have to choose. Amy." Daniel folded the note carefully and tucked it into his wallet, next to the photo of Mila he always carried. This was why it had all mattered, not the award or the recognition, but the knowledge that his struggle had made someone else's path easier. The weeks that followed brought unexpected momentum. The revised personal device policy became a model for other hospitals in the region. Eleanor received invitations to speak at healthcare conferences about creating compassionate workplace cultures. Dr. Morrison initiated a hospital-wide review of policies that might inadvertently punish staff for being caregivers, uncovering dozens of outdated rules that prioritized rigid control over human flexibility. But the most profound changes happened in smaller, quieter moments. Daniel noticed nurses checking their phones openly instead of hiding in supply closets. He saw a physician step out of rounds to call his son's school without apologizing profusely. He watched staff members support each other through emergencies instead of judging each other for having them. The mentorship program flourished. Daniel met weekly with 4 nurses navigating single parenthood, sharing strategies and offering the reassurance he desperately needed 6 months earlier. One was a young father whose wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with premature twins and overwhelming grief. Another was a grandmother raising her drug-addicted daughter's children while maintaining a full-time ICU schedule. Each carried burdens that would have crushed weaker people, and each was terrified of being seen as inadequate professionally because of their personal responsibilities. Daniel told them what Eleanor had finally understood, that carrying those burdens made them stronger, not weaker. That the compassion required to care for vulnerable family members was the same compassion that made them exceptional nurses. That they didn't have to compartmentalize their humanity to be respected. "But what if I make a mistake?" the young father asked during one session, his voice raw with fear. "What if I'm so tired from being up all night with the twins that I miss something critical at work?" "Then you use the same safety nets we all use," Daniel responded. "You double-check medication calculations. You ask colleagues to verify orders when you're exhausted. You acknowledge your limitations instead of pretending they don't exist. Being a good nurse isn't about being superhuman. It's about being honest about your humanity and building systems to support it." The grandmother nodded vigorously. "That's what I needed to hear. I've been so scared of appearing incompetent that I haven't asked for help even when I needed it." "Asking for help is competence," Daniel said firmly. "It's recognizing when you're at capacity and bringing in support before patient care suffers. That's professional judgment, not weakness." These conversations reminded Daniel how far he'd come. 6 months ago, he'd been the one terrified and asking these same questions. Now he could offer answers born from lived experience, could be the voice of reassurance he desperately sought. Eleanor's transformation continued in equally profound ways. She began sharing her mother's story openly, using it to illustrate why compassionate policies mattered. At a staff development session, she showed photos of Catherine from before the Alzheimer's, vibrant and laughing, surrounded by students she'd taught, and after, when confusion had stolen her memories but left her fundamental kindness intact. "I wasted months hiding this," Eleanor told the assembled staff. "I thought admitting I had an aging parent would make people see me as distracted or weak. Instead, hiding it made me harsh and judgmental, especially toward anyone who reminded me of my own vulnerability." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "Daniel Cross reminded me that we don't have to choose between professional excellence and personal humanity. We can be both. We must be both." The speech earned a standing ovation and cemented Eleanor's reputation as a leader who'd undergone genuine transformation. But for Daniel, the real evidence came in smaller moments, like the afternoon he found Eleanor sitting with a young nurse who'd just learned her father had terminal cancer, offering quiet support and practical resources without checking her watch or hurrying back to administrative tasks. 2 months after the gala, Eleanor called Daniel into her office. He entered to find her smiling, genuinely pleased about something, and gestured him to sit. "I wanted you to hear this before the official announcement," she said. "The hospital board has approved a pilot program for on-site childcare for staff. It'll be subsidized based on income, available for emergency situations and during shift hours. They're crediting our work on the device policy as the catalyst, recognizing that supporting staff families improves retention and patient care outcomes." Daniel felt his breath catch. On-site childcare meant Mila could be nearby when after-school care fell through. It meant eliminating the frantic scramble for backup sitters, the desperate calculations of whether he could afford another emergency childcare day. It meant security he'd never dared to hope for. "When does it start?" "Soft launch in 6 weeks, full implementation by fall. You'll be one of the first families eligible." Eleanor's smile widened. "I may have mentioned to the board that having Mila nearby during the gala, seeing how proud she was of her father, reminded them that staff children are part of our hospital family too. They deserved consideration in our planning." "Thank you," Daniel managed. Eleanor, this changes everything." That's the idea. Change what needs changing, support what needs supporting, and trust that investing in our people's whole lives makes them better at their jobs, not worse. She pulled out another document. "There's something else. Dr. Morrison is stepping back from day-to-day unit management to focus on research. He's recommended a leadership restructure, co-directors instead of a single unit manager. He's proposing you and me." Daniel stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "Co-directors?" "Eleanor, I'm a staff nurse. I don't have management experience. You have something better, frontline perspective and the trust of every person in this unit. You know what staff need because you've lived it. You understand the balance between clinical excellence and human compassion because you embody it daily." Eleanor leaned forward. "I need someone to keep me honest, Daniel. Someone who'll push back when policies become more important than people. Someone who won't let me forget why we made these changes in the first place. That's you. What about the other nurses? Marcus has more seniority. Marcus turned it down, said you're the obvious choice and he'd rather keep doing direct patient care. Eleanor's expression softened. Everyone I asked said the same thing. You're already a leader here, Daniel. This would just formalize what's already true. Daniel thought about it. The increased responsibility, the time commitment, the complexity of management versus direct care. Then he thought about Amy's note in his wallet, about the young father in his mentorship group, about every nurse still struggling to balance impossible demands. If he could shape policies that made their lives easier, wasn't that worth the sacrifice? I need one guarantee, he said finally. I still work direct patient care at least 2 shifts a week. I can't lead nurses if I forget what nursing actually looks like on the floor. Done. We'll structure it so we split administrative duties and both maintain clinical rotations. Eleanor extended her hand. Partners? Daniel shook it. Partners. The announcement came the following week, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Staff saw it as validation that clinical excellence and lived experience were valued as much as administrative credentials. Patients' families appreciated having someone in leadership who understood their fear because he'd lived it. And Mila was thrilled that her daddy had gotten another promotion, even if she didn't fully understand what it meant. The transition into leadership was challenging. Daniel had to learn budget management, conflict resolution, strategic planning, skills that didn't come naturally, but that Eleanor patiently taught. In exchange, he helped her understand the frontline realities that administrative perspective often missed. When she proposed a new documentation system that would add 30 minutes to each nurse's shift, Daniel brought in 3 staff nurses to explain why it was unworkable. When he wanted to eliminate all overtime to save money, Eleanor showed him the data proving that adequate staffing improved patient outcomes enough to offset the cost. They balanced each other. Eleanor's organizational skills and strategic thinking, combined with Daniel's empathy and clinical insight, created something stronger than either could have achieved alone. Their partnership became the model for the kind of collaborative leadership the hospital desperately needed. 3 months into their co-directorship, Daniel faced his first major crisis in the new role. A nurse named Jennifer had been involved in a medication error. Not fatal, caught before administration, but serious enough to warrant investigation. The old Eleanor would have immediately initiated disciplinary proceedings. The new Eleanor and Daniel needed to determine whether this was negligence requiring consequences or a system failure requiring better safeguards. They interviewed Jennifer together, and what emerged was a familiar story. She'd been awake for 36 hours. Her elderly mother had fallen, required hospitalization, and Jennifer had spent the night coordinating care before reporting for her scheduled shift. She'd been exhausted, distracted, and had grabbed the wrong medication from a poorly organized supply cart. The 5 rights check had caught the error, but barely. "Why didn't you call in sick?" Daniel asked gently. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "I've already used all my sick time for my mother's appointments. I can't afford unpaid leave. I thought I could push through, but..." She shook her head miserably. "I almost hurt someone because I was too stubborn to admit I couldn't function." Eleanor and Daniel exchanged glances. This wasn't about disciplining Jennifer. It was about fixing the system that had put her in this impossible position. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said. "You're going home, with pay, for the next 3 days. We're calling it administrative leave while we investigate, but really it's because you need rest. Eleanor and I will work with HR to create a compassionate leave bank, donated time from staff who want to help colleagues in crisis. And we're going to redesign the medication supply system so even exhausted nurses have better safeguards." Jennifer stared at them. "You're not firing me?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "We're supporting you, and we're fixing the systems that failed you. But Jennifer, in the future, you call in. You don't come to work when you're impaired, no matter the reason. Patient safety requires that honesty." "I will, I promise." "Thank you. Thank you so much." After Jennifer left, Eleanor turned to Daniel. 6 months ago, I would have written her up without question, followed policy, protected the hospital from liability, and never considered the human factors that led to the error. And 6 months ago, I would have been terrified to report any mistake because I assumed punishment was inevitable, Daniel replied. We've both changed. The whole culture has changed. Because you refused to accept that caring about your daughter made you a bad nurse. You stood up when it would have been easier to comply, and that courage cascaded into all of this. Eleanor gestured around them. Better policies, compassionate leave on-site childcare, leadership that values whole people. None of it would exist if you just signed that performance improvement plan and stayed silent. Daniel thought about that 3 a.m. email, the terror of walking into the HR meeting the moment he decided to speak truth instead of apology. It had seemed like such a small act at the time, just refusing to pretend that checking on his daughter was wrong. But small acts of courage, he'd learned, could reshape entire systems when they resonated with others who'd been silently suffering. The on-site childcare center opened in September, just as promised. It was a bright, cheerful space on the hospital's ground floor, staffed by certified teachers and equipped for children from infancy through elementary age. Mila was fascinated by it, though at 7 she only needed it occasionally when after-school care fell through or Daniel's schedule shifted unexpectedly. The real impact showed in retention numbers. 3 nurses who'd been on the verge of quitting, unable to afford private childcare on nursing salaries, stayed because the subsidized on-site option made working financially viable. 2 physicians who'd reduced hours due to childcare challenges returned to full-time. The initial investment paid for itself within months through reduced turnover and recruitment costs. Daniel walked through the center during its opening week, watching children play while their parents worked floors above. One toddler was building blocks while his mother, a surgical nurse, grabbed a quick lunch break with him. A school-age girl did homework in the quiet corner while her father, an ER physician, finished his shift. And there was Mila, teaching a younger child how to play checkers, her natural leadership emerging in this new context. "Daddy!" She ran over when she spotted him. "This place is so cool. Can I come here every day?" Daniel laughed. "You've got school most days, sweetheart. But when you need to, yes, you can come here." "All the kids here have parents who help people," Mila observed seriously. "Just like you help sick kids. We're all part of the same family, aren't we?" The insight struck Daniel profoundly. That's exactly what they'd created, a hospital family that recognized staff weren't just employees, but whole people with whole lives. Children weren't distractions from work, but motivations for it. Caregiving responsibilities weren't liabilities, but evidence of the compassion that made healthcare workers exceptional. 6 months into the co-directorship, Eleanor approached Daniel with unexpected news. Catherine's condition had deteriorated significantly. She was now in hospice care, her lucid moments increasingly rare, her body slowly shutting down as the disease consumed what remained. "I'm taking family leave," Eleanor said, her voice steady, but her eyes betrayed the grief beneath. "Dr. Morrison has approved 2 weeks, but I may need longer. Can you manage the unit alone?" "Take whatever time you need," Daniel said immediately. "The unit will be here when you're ready. Your mother won't." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "She asked for me yesterday, actually used my name, knew who I was. First time in 2 months. She told me she was proud of me, that I'd finally learned to lead with my heart, instead of just my head." Tears spilled over. Then she forgot again. But for those 5 minutes, she was my mother. And she was proud. Daniel pulled Eleanor into a hug, feeling her shake with suppressed sobs. She's always been proud, even when she couldn't say it. "I know, but hearing it one last time," Eleanor stepped back, wiping her eyes. "I'm grateful I got that. I'm grateful for a lot of things, including the second chance you gave me when I didn't deserve it." We all deserve second chances. That's what this whole year has taught me. Eleanor left that afternoon, and Daniel assumed full unit management. It was exhausting, overseeing staff schedules, handling patient complaints, managing budgets, all while maintaining his clinical shifts and mentorship commitments. But the staff rallied around him, picking up extra responsibilities without being asked, recognizing he was carrying Eleanor's load in addition to his own. Catherine died 9 days later, peacefully, with Eleanor holding her hand. The funeral was small and private, but the hospital sent flowers and nearly 40 staff members signed a condolence card, sharing how Eleanor's openness about her mother had changed their perspectives on caregiving. Daniel attended the memorial service with Mila, who insisted on bringing a drawing she'd made. Catherine surrounded by flowers and butterflies, smiling and looking peaceful. Eleanor accepted it with tears streaming down her face. "She would have loved this," Eleanor whispered, hugging Mila gently. "Thank you, sweetheart." "Mrs. Catherine was nice," Mila said simply. "I'm sorry she had to go away." "Me too. But I'm grateful I got to know her, and grateful she got to meet you and your daddy. You helped me remember what matters." Eleanor took 3 weeks total before returning to work, and when she did, something essential had shifted. The grief was still visible, in the shadows under her eyes, the moments when she'd pause mid-sentence as if listening for someone who wasn't there. But there was also peace. She'd been present for her mother's final days without guilt or divided attention. She'd prioritized what mattered most, and that choice had given her the closure she needed. "Thank you for holding everything together," she told Daniel on her first day back. "That's what partners do. You'd have done the same for me." "I will, when you need it." That's the promise we're making to each other and to this staff, that when life happens, we support each other through it instead of punishing people for being human. The year anniversary of Daniel's near termination arrived in late autumn. The hospital organized a celebration of the policy changes and their impact, inviting staff from across departments to share how the new culture had affected their lives. The conference room overflowed with people, and Daniel was asked to speak about the journey from crisis to transformation. He stood at the podium with Mila beside him. She'd asked to come, wanting to see where her daddy worked, and looked out at faces he'd come to know well. Nurses who'd been strangers a year ago were now colleagues and friends. Eleanor, who'd been his adversary, was now his trusted partner. Dr. Morrison, who'd intervened at a critical moment, smiled encouragingly from the front row. "A year ago," Daniel began, "I received an email at 3 a.m. that I thought would end my career. I was being called to HR for checking on my daughter 17 times in 6 months. I was terrified, convinced that being a single parent made me unemployable, that I'd have to choose between my child and my profession." He felt Mila's small hand slip into his and squeezed gently. "What I didn't know then was that my fear was shared by dozens of people in this hospital. Nurses hiding in supply closets to call schools, physicians sneaking phone checks between patient consults, therapists pretending they didn't have aging parents requiring daily coordination. We were all scared, all hiding, all convinced we had to compartmentalize our humanity to be respected professionally." Daniel looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. "One person changed that, Eleanor Graves, who started as my harshest critic and became my greatest ally. She had the courage to admit she was wrong, to acknowledge her own struggles, and to lead the transformation of our workplace culture. Because of her willingness to change, we all changed." The room applauded, and Eleanor stood, gesturing for Daniel to continue. "But this isn't just about policy changes or award ceremonies. It's about something fundamental, the recognition that we're all whole people, not fractured fragments trying to seal off parts of ourselves to fit institutional expectations. The best nurse I can be is the one who brings all of me to work, including my experience as a single father, my understanding of desperate fear, my compassion born from personal loss. Taking away those parts wouldn't make me more professional. It would make me less human and therefore less effective." He squeezed Mila's hand again. "This is my daughter, Mila. She's 7 years old. She's the reason I fought so hard to change these policies, because I needed her to grow up knowing her father chose her without apology or shame. But she's also the reason I'm a good nurse, because understanding what parents are feeling when their child is in the ICU comes from living that terror myself." Mila stepped forward slightly, emboldened by the attention. "My daddy is the best nurse because he has a big heart, big enough for me and for all the sick kids he helps. You don't have to choose between being a good daddy and being good at your job. You can be both." The room erupted in applause and not a few tears. Daniel pulled Mila close, overwhelmed by her simple wisdom, by how clearly she understood what he'd been fighting for all along. When the noise subsided, Daniel concluded with the message he most wanted people to hear. "We've changed a lot this year, policies, culture, leadership structures, but the most important change is this. We've stopped pretending that caring about our families makes us weak. We've started recognizing it as strength, And that recognition has made us better at everything we do. He paused, letting the words settle. So to anyone still hiding their caregiving responsibilities, still afraid that being human makes them inadequate, stop hiding. Bring your whole self to work. Ask for support when you need it. Trust that your colleagues will rally around you because that's what we do now. We take care of each other, and in doing so, we take better care of our patients. The celebration continued for another hour, people sharing stories, expressing gratitude, cementing bonds that had formed through shared vulnerability. Daniel watched it all with profound satisfaction, knowing this community hadn't existed a year ago. They'd built it together, brick by brick, courage by courage, truth by truth. As the event wound down, Dr. Morrison approached with an older couple Daniel didn't recognize. Daniel, I'd like you to meet some special visitors. This is Thomas and Linda Reeves, Emma's grandparents. They've been following your story. Emma, the 8-year-old with the ruptured appendix, one of Daniel's first patients after the HR meeting. He remembered her bright smile, her mother's exhausted gratitude, the way Emma had drawn him a thank you picture before discharge. Linda Reeves was crying softly. Our daughter told us what you did for Emma, but more importantly, what you did for her. She was terrified, alone in that hospital room, and you sat with her for 30 minutes after your shift ended, just talking about Emma's favorite books. You made her feel less alone. That's my job, Daniel said, uncomfortable with the praise. No, Thomas corrected gently. Your job is medical care. What you gave our daughter was compassion, understanding, and the recognition that she was a parent desperate for reassurance. You gave that freely because you understood it personally. He pulled an envelope from his pocket. We're making a donation to the hospital in your name, specifically to fund the childcare center so other single parents can work without the terror you faced. Daniel opened the envelope and nearly dropped it. The check was for $50,000. I can't accept this. You're not accepting it personally. It's going to the hospital, designated for the childcare program. Linda smiled through her tears. Emma's fine now, thriving actually. But we'll never forget the nurse who cared for our whole family, not just our granddaughter. This is how we say thank you. The donation, announced publicly, sparked additional contributions. Within weeks, the childcare center had enough funding to expand capacity and reduce fees further. More families could access it. More children had safe places while parents worked. More caregivers could function without constant panic about coverage. One small act of kindness, Daniel sitting with a frightened mother after his shift, had cascaded into funding that would help hundreds of families. It was the perfect illustration of what they'd been trying to prove all along, that compassion created ripples far beyond its immediate impact. As winter approached and the year drew to a close, Daniel found himself reflecting on the journey during his evening routine with Mila. They were making dinner together. She was old enough now to help with simple tasks, and she chattered about school while chopping vegetables with careful concentration. Daddy, Emma from your work came to my school today for a visit program. She told everyone about when she was sick and you helped her. She said you're a hero. Daniel smiled, stirring pasta sauce. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just a nurse doing my job. That's what heroes say, Mila insisted. But I know the truth. You're a hero because you help people even when it's hard, even when you're scared. Where'd you learn that definition? From you. You were scared when Eleanor was mean to you, but you stood up anyway. That's what brave means, doing the right thing even when you're scared. Daniel set down the spoon and knelt to Mila's level. You know what? You're right. I was terrified. But I stood up because of you, because I needed you to see that fighting for what's right is always worth it, even when the odds seem impossible. Mila wrapped her arms around his neck. I'm glad you fought, Daddy. Everything's better now. And it was better. Tangibly, measurably better. The hospital had lower turnover, higher staff satisfaction, improved patient outcomes. The childcare center was thriving. The mentorship program had expanded to other departments. Eleanor was leading with compassion tempered by wisdom, and Daniel himself had grown from a terrified nurse fighting for survival into a leader helping others navigate similar struggles. But the best improvement couldn't be measured in metrics or policies. It was in moments like this, making dinner with his daughter, no longer consumed by fear, secure in the knowledge that his job and his role as Mila's father could coexist without constant crisis. It was in sleeping through the night without jolting awake in panic. It was in checking his phone openly when needed, without shame or surveillance. It was in being whole. That Christmas, the hospital hosted a family event where staff could bring their children to see where they worked. The pediatric ICU transformed into a wonderland of decorations and activities. Mila helped organize a craft station where children made cards for current patients. Eleanor's mother had passed, but Eleanor channeled her grief into making the event beautiful, honoring Catherine's memory by creating joy for other families. Daniel watched children explore the unit, their faces lit with curiosity and pride, seeing where their parents spent their days. He saw understanding dawn, that mommy or daddy weren't just going to a job, they were helping sick kids get better. That their absence during school, plays, or bedtime served a purpose beyond paychecks. Emma Reeves attended with her mother and grandparents, and when she saw Daniel, she ran to hug him. "Mr. Daniel, this is where you saved me." "This is where a whole team helped you get better," Daniel corrected gently. "Nursing isn't one person, it's everyone working together." But Emma insisted on showing him the scar from her appendectomy surgery, now healed into a thin line, and telling anyone who'd listen about the nurse who'd made her mother laugh when she'd been too scared to smile. As the event concluded and families filed out into the winter evening, Eleanor stood beside Daniel watching the exodus. "We did something good here," she said quietly. "We did something necessary," Daniel replied. "We proved that hospitals can support whole people, not just extract professional performance while ignoring personal reality." Other hospitals are watching. 3 facilities have contacted me about implementing similar policies. Your story, our story, is spreading. Daniel thought about that. How many other nurses were hiding in supply closets right now, terrified of being caught caring about their children? How many parents were choosing between paychecks and school conferences? How many caregivers were drowning in guilt and fear, convinced they had to fragment themselves to survive? If their transformation at St. Catherine's could light a path for others, could create permission for compassion in institutions that had forgotten how, then everything they'd endured had purpose beyond their own relief. "Good," Daniel said. "Let it spread. Let every hospital understand that the best patient care comes from people who are allowed to be fully human. Let every policy be written with grace instead of suspicion. Let every caregiver, professional and personal, know they don't have to choose." Eleanor smiled. "That's the mission statement. I'm using that in my next conference presentation." As Daniel drove home that night, Mila asleep in the back seat clutching the ornament she'd made in the craft session, he felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. Not grateful for the suffering, he wouldn't wish those terrifying months on anyone, but grateful for what had emerged from it. He'd learned that standing up for principle, even when it risked everything, could catalyze transformation. That one person's courage could give permission for others to be honest about their struggles. That institutions could change when individuals refused to accept unjust norms. That compassion was contagious, spreading from person to person until it reshaped entire cultures. Most importantly, he'd learned that being Mila's father and being an excellent nurse weren't contradictory identities requiring impossible choices. They were complementary truths that made him better at both. The love that drove him to check on his daughter was the same love that made him exceptional at comforting terrified parents in the ICU. They were inseparable, and finally, that truth was recognized and valued. Daniel carried sleeping Mila into their apartment, tucked her into bed, and stood in her doorway as he'd done countless times. But tonight felt different. Tonight he wasn't standing there out of fear that everything might collapse. He was standing there out of gratitude that everything had held. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Thank you for everything this year. You saved more than your own career. You saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be. Merry Christmas, partner." Daniel typed back. "Thank you for having the courage to change. Merry Christmas." He set his phone aside and moved to his bedroom, where the Crystal Award still sat on his dresser catching moonlight. Next to it now was a framed photo from the gala, Daniel in his rented suit, Mila in her thrift store dress, both beaming with joy and pride. They looked happy, secure, whole. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the city in white. Daniel watched it through his window, thinking about transformation and grace, about courage and compassion, about all the impossible things that had become possible when he'd refused to apologize for loving his daughter. The email that had arrived at 3 a.m. a year ago had seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it had been a beginning, the catalyst for changes that had reshaped not just his life, but an entire institution's culture. One terrified father's refusal to choose between his child and his profession had created space for hundreds of others to bring their whole selves to work. And that, Daniel thought, as sleep finally claimed him, was the most profound kind of victory. Not personal triumph, but collective transformation. Not individual salvation, but systemic change that would outlast any one person's career. The battle he'd fought hadn't just been for himself and Mila. It had been for every caregiver who came after, every parent who'd need permission to be both professional and human, every person who'd be told they had to choose between love and livelihood. He'd fought that battle and won. And because of that victory, countless others wouldn't have to fight it at all. They could simply be whole from the very beginning without apology or fear. That was the legacy worth building. That was the transformation worth fighting for. And as Daniel drifted into peaceful sleep, secure in his job and his role as Mila's father, he knew with absolute certainty that every terrifying moment, every sacrifice, every act of courage had been worth it. Because love, fierce, protective, unconditional love, was always worth fighting for. And now, finally, the world agreed.